Settle in now, dear listener, and let your breathing slow. Tonight, we journey to the windswept highlands of Scotland, where magic runs as deep as the lochs, and where the Moody family has stood guard against darkness for generations untold. In the mists of the Scottish Highlands, where ancient magic seeps from the very stones, and the wind carries whispers of spells cast centuries ago, there exists a lineage of witches and wizards who have, for as long as magical memory recalls, dedicated themselves to a single, unwavering purpose: the protection of the innocent and the pursuit of those who would do harm. This is the story of the Moody family and of their most famous son, Alastor, known to history as Mad-Eye Moody, though in his beginning he was simply a child born into a world of shadows and light. The Moody family tree stretches back through the centuries like the roots of an ancient oak, deep and tangled, reaching into times when wizards openly walked the Scottish moors, and when the boundary between the magical and mundane worlds was thinner than morning mist. They were never a family of great political power or vast wealth, never numbered among the sacred 28, never courtiers in the halls of magical government. No, the Moodys were something else entirely, something perhaps more vital, though less celebrated. They were hunters, protectors, the ones who stood between the darkness and the dawn. Generation after generation, Moody men and women had served as Aurors, as magical law enforcers, as the quiet guardians who asked for no glory, but demanded only that evil be held at bay. Their family grimoire, passed down through the ages, contained not elaborate spells of transfiguration or charms for social climbing, but rather defensive enchantments of devastating efficiency, tracking spells refined over centuries, and counter curses that could unravel the darkest magic. It was said, though softly, and only among those who knew, that a Moody had helped track Emmerich the Evil in the 15th century, that another had stood against the dark wizard Rasidian, and that in every generation when darkness rose, a Moody rose to meet it. The family home stood, and perhaps still stands, hidden beneath layers of protective enchantments, in a remote glen where few travellers ventured, and fewer still could find their way twice. It was not a grand manor, not a towering castle with spires reaching toward the clouds. Instead, it was a sturdy stone house, built low against the wind, with thick walls that had weathered countless storms, both natural and magical. Heather grew wild around its foundations, and rowan trees, those ancient protectors against dark magic, formed a living barrier at the boundaries of the property. Every stone had been set with purpose, every window positioned to allow clear views of approaching paths, every door reinforced with spells that had been refined over generations. Inside, the house breathed with the accumulated magic of centuries. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes following visitors with an alertness that suggested they took their guardianship seriously even in their two-dimensional retirement. Shelves sagged under the weight of books, not the elegant gold-embossed volumes of wealthy families, but practical, well-worn tomes on dark creatures, defensive magic, and the history of dark wizards and their downfall. The fireplace, large enough for a grown wizard to stand in, burned with flames that could be adjusted with a thought, warm and welcoming for family, blazing hot enough to melt iron should intruders breach the outer defenses. It was into this world, in the year 1920, that Alastor Moody was born. The date of his birth is not recorded in grand magical registries, not celebrated in historical texts, for the Moodys were a private family and saw no need to announce their arrivals to the wider world. But those who knew the family mark the date as being in late autumn, when the highland moors turned gold and russet, when the first frost touched the heather, and when the nights grew long enough for vigilance to truly matter. His mother, Alastor Moody, brought him into the world during a night of storms, with thunder rolling across the mountains, like the drums of war and lightning illuminating the glen in flashes of brilliant white. Some said it was an omen. Others said it was simply Scotland. Isla was herself a formidable witch, descended from a line of healers who had nevertheless learned combat magic out of sheer necessity. For in the Scottish Highlands, even those who saved lives needed to know how to defend them. She had met Alastor's father, Fergus Moody, during a dark wizard hunt in the Hebrides, where she had been tending to the victims of a curse slinger, and Fergus had been tracking the perpetrator. It was, by all accounts, not a romantic meeting in the traditional sense, but rather a partnership forged in necessity that grew into something deeper, a mutual respect that blossomed into love, the kind of love built on trust and shared purpose, rather than fleeting passion. Fergus Moody was, in his time, one of the most respected Aurors in the Ministry of Magic's employment, though he worked primarily in the field rather than in the corridors of power. He was a man of few words and fewer smiles, with a face weathered by wind and worry, and eyes that seemed to see through pretense and deception as easily as one might see through glass. He had fought in the shadows of magical Britain's wars, had faced dark wizards whose names were spoken only in whispers, and had earned scars, both visible and otherwise, in service of a world that often did not know it needed protecting. When Fergus held his newborn son for the first time, cradling the small, squalling bundle near the fire's warmth, those who were present said they saw something shift in his weathered face. Not softness, precisely, for Fergus Moody was not a soft man, but perhaps a deepening of purpose. He looked down at the child, at the tiny fists waving in the air, at the eyes that had not yet learned to focus, but would one day see things that should not exist, and he made a silent vow that this boy would be prepared for the world as it truly was, not as one might wish it to be. Alastor, Isla named him, her voice tired but triumphant. The name meant defender of the people in the ancient Greek, a fitting name for a Moody, though neither parent could have known just how fitting it would prove to be. The boy's early years unfolded in the protective embrace of that Highland home, where the boundary between childhood innocence and necessary preparation was thinner than in most wizarding families. While other magical children might play with toy broomsticks and practice levitating feathers, young Alastor was taught from his earliest days to be aware, to observe, to question. His father would walk with him through the heather, pointing out the signs of magical creatures, teaching him to read the landscape for danger, showing him how a broken twig might indicate a trail, how disturbed earth might reveal a concealed entrance, how the behavior of birds could warn of approaching threats. The world, Fergus would say, his voice low and serious, is full of wonders, lad, but it's also full of those who would use magic for dark purposes. A Moody must always watch, always listen, always be ready. It might have been a heavy burden for a child, this constant emphasis on vigilance and danger, but Alastor seemed to absorb it as naturally as other children absorbed fairy tales. Perhaps it was in his blood, this understanding that magic was not merely for entertainment or convenience, but a tool that could save lives or end them, depending on the hand that wielded it. Or perhaps it was simply that he loved his father and wanted to learn everything the stern man had to teach. His mother balanced this with warmth and stories, with healing lessons and the gentler magics of protection and care. She taught him that vigilance was not merely about expecting attack, but about caring enough to prevent harm, that the true purpose of all their defensive knowledge was not to defeat enemies, but to preserve life. From her, he learned that strength and compassion were not opposites, but complements, two sides of the same galleon. The house itself was Alastor's first classroom in magical defense. Every room held lessons. The windows, he learned, were not merely glass, but contained subtle alarm charms that would alert the family to approaching visitors. The doors would open for family and invited guests, but would resist others with surprising force. The portraits, he discovered with delight, were not merely decorative, but served as additional sets of eyes, magical sentries who could raise alarm or offer counsel. His great-great-grandfather's portrait, a door-faced wizard with a magnificent mustache, took particular interest in young Alastor and would quiz him on defensive strategies while the boy played on the floor below. "What would you do?" the portrait would rumble, "if a dark wizard approached from the north while you were tending the garden?" Little Alastor, no more than 5 years old, would scrunch his face in concentration. "Use the rowan trees for cover," he might answer. "They block dark magic," then alert father with the family signal. "Good lad," the portrait would grunt. "But what if your father is away?" And so the lessons continued, woven into the fabric of daily life as naturally as breathing. The era into which Alastor was born was one of uneasy peace in the magical world. The dark wizard, Grindelwald, had not yet risen to the height of his terrible power, but whispers of his activities on the European continent were beginning to reach Britain's shores. The Ministry of Magic, ever cautious after centuries of conflict between magical and non-magical peoples, maintained its protocols of secrecy and vigilance. Aurors like Moody worked quietly, efficiently, dealing with threats before they could grow into full-blown crises, protecting a magical community that preferred not to think too deeply about the dangers kept at bay. But in the Moody household, there was no such comfortable ignorance. Young Alastor grew up hearing his father's accounts of missions completed and threats neutralized, of dark wizards apprehended and cursed objects secured. These were not told as exciting adventure stories, but as lessons, cautionary tales, examples of what could happen when good witches and wizards let their guard down, or when dark magic was underestimated. There was a wizard in Aberdeen, Fergus might say, over dinner, his voice matter-of-fact, who thought he could dabble in dark artifacts without consequence, thought he was clever enough to control them. Last week, I had to peel what was left of him off the walls of his study. Dark magic always has a cost, Alastor. Always. Remember that Isla would sometimes sigh at these dinner table lessons, but she never objected. She understood that her son was being prepared for a future that seemed almost inevitable, given his lineage his aptitude, and the state of the world. As Alastor grew from infant to toddler to young boy, the family watched for signs of his magical ability with interest. In most wizarding families, accidental magic might manifest in moments of strong emotion. Toys flying across rooms during tantrums, hair changing color when upset, accidental levitation when excited. With Alastor, the first clear signs of magic were different, though perhaps predictable, given his upbringing. He was 6 years old, playing in the garden, under the watchful eyes of both his mother and a family portrait, when a stranger appeared at the edge of the property. The protective enchantments should have prevented such an approach, but this visitor was powerful enough, or subtle enough, to bypass the outer wards. Isla later said she felt the disturbance in the magical field around the house, but had not yet identified its source, when young Alastor suddenly went very still. The boy stood among the heather, his small body tense, his head cocked as if listening to something no one else could hear. Then, without being taught, without any instruction or conscious thought, he raised his hand, and the air around him seemed to shimmer, solidifying into a barely visible barrier, just as the stranger, who turned out to be a ministry official with poor manners and worse timing, stepped forward. The official bounced off the shield as surely as if he'd walked into a stone wall. Fergus, who had been in his study, appeared at the door within seconds, wand drawn. Isla had her own wand, out positioning herself between the stranger and her son. But Alastor stood calm, his shield still shimmering around him, his young face set in an expression of concentration far beyond his years. After the official had been identified and rather forcefully reminded that arriving unannounced at the Moody residence was both rude and potentially dangerous, after the shields had been lowered and the tension dissipated, Fergus knelt beside his son. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. Alastor frowned, trying to put into words something he'd felt rather than thought. "The air felt wrong," he said finally. Like it does before a storm, but different, prickly." Fergus and Isla exchanged glances. Their son, at 6 years old, had already developed the magical sensitivity that some Aurors trained for years to achieve. The ability to sense disturbances in magical fields, to feel the approach of unknown magic. Combined with his instinctive shield work, it suggested that Alastor Moody would indeed walk the path his ancestors had walked. That night, after Alastor had been tucked into bed, Fergus stood by the fire, staring into the flames. Isla joined him, slipping her hand into his. "He'll be extraordinary," she said softly. "Aye," Fergus agreed, his voice heavy. "And that means he'll face extraordinary dangers. The talented ones always do. Then we'll prepare him as best we can. That we will. Though I wonder sometimes." He trailed off, his expression distant. "What do you wonder? Whether it's a gift or a curse, this ability to see the darkness so clearly, to always be watching for the next threat, the next danger. It's a hard way to live, Isla. Necessary, aye, but hard." Isla squeezed his hand. "He'll also have love, loyalty, purpose. Those will sustain him, as they've sustained every Moody who came before." The years between Alastor's first manifestation of defensive magic and his 11th birthday unfolded like the turning of seasons in the Highlands, each one bringing new growth, new understanding, and new challenges that would shape the wizard he was destined to become. While other magical children were learning to control their accidental magic, through gentle encouragement and patience, young Alastor was being systematically trained in the very foundations of magical vigilance that would one day save his life countless times over. His 7th year brought the first incident that would become family legend, whispered about in later years as the moment when everyone truly understood what kind of wizard Alastor would become. It happened on a crisp autumn morning when the sun had just begun to burn away the mist that settled in the glen each night like a living thing. Fergus had taken his son on what seemed to be a simple walk through the moorland, ostensibly to gather herbs for Isler's healing stores, but in truth to teach yet another lesson in awareness and preparation. They walked together in comfortable silence, the boy's shorter legs working hard to match his father's steady pace. Fergus pointed out tracks in the soft earth, the delicate prints of a fairy crossing the path, the heavier marks of an easel on the hunt, the disturbed ground where a gnome had burrowed during the night. Alastor absorbed everything with the quiet intensity that had become his characteristic expression, his young eyes sharp and missing little. "Always watch the ground," Fergus instructed, his voice low and serious. "And the sky, and the trees. A good Auror develops eyes in the back of his head, lad, even before he's got a magical eye to help him see." Neither of them could have known in that moment the terrible irony those words would one day hold. They had ventured perhaps a mile from the house when Alastor suddenly stopped walking. His small body went rigid, his head tilting in that characteristic way he had when sensing something amiss. Fergus, ever alert to his son's reactions, immediately had his wand in hand, his eyes scanning the moorland for threats. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Alastor pointed toward a cluster of rocks about 30 yards distant. "Something's wrong there," he said, his voice uncertain but firm. "The magic feels twisted, dark." Fergus studied the rocks, seeing nothing obvious, sensing nothing with his own considerable magical awareness. Another father might have dismissed a 7-year-old's concerns, might have assumed an overactive imagination fueled by too many cautionary tales. But Fergus Moody knew better than to ignore his son's instincts, especially given what the boy had already demonstrated. He approached the rocks carefully, wand raised, magical senses straining. As he drew closer, he finally felt it, a subtle wrongness in the magical field, a taint of dark magic, so carefully concealed that he had nearly missed it. Behind the largest boulder, buried in a shallow depression and covered with a layer of concealment charms, lay a cursed object, a silver amulet pulsing with malevolent energy, likely left as a trap for some unfortunate creature, or perhaps even for wandering wizards. With careful precision, Fergus neutralized the curse and secured the object, all while his 7-year-old son watched intently, learning. When the work was done and the cursed amulet was safely contained in a warded bag, Fergus knelt beside Alastor. "How did you sense it?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "I've been training my senses for 30 years, and I nearly walked right past it." Alastor's face scrunched in concentration, trying to articulate something. He barely understood himself. "It's like the magic here is supposed to feel a certain way. Clean, like water from the stream. But that thing made it feel dirty, like oil floating on top of the water. I could feel the difference." Fergus felt pride swell in his chest, though he kept his expression neutral. His son wasn't merely sensitive to magic, He could distinguish between natural magical fields and corrupted ones, could sense the signature of dark magic even when concealed by layers of sophisticated charms. It was a rare gift, one that would serve him well in the years to come, though it also marked him as someone who would inevitably be drawn into the fight against darkness. That evening, by the fire, Fergus told Isla what had happened. She listened with a mixture of pride and worry, her healer's hands clasped together as if in prayer. "He's so young," she said softly, "to already be touching such darkness." "Aye," Fergus agreed, "but better he learns to recognize it now, under controlled circumstances, than discovers it unprepared when his life depends on it." Upstairs, young Alastor lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling where shadows danced in the light from the hearth below. He didn't fully understand why finding the cursed object had felt so important, but he could still feel the echo of its wrongness, like a bad taste that lingered long after spoiled food had been spat out. He made a silent promise to himself that night, a child's vow that would shape his entire life. He would learn to recognize that feeling, that taint of darkness, so well that he could protect others from it, so that no one would be hurt by things they couldn't see coming. It was the birth of his philosophy of constant vigilance, though he wouldn't have those words for it for many years yet. As Alastor grew older, his magical education intensified in ways that would have seemed severe to outsiders, but felt natural within the context of the Moody household. On his 8th birthday, instead of toys or sweets, his father gave him his first wand. Not the wand he would eventually bond with at Ollivanders, but a practice wand, carefully calibrated to allow a young wizard to learn control without the full power that could prove dangerous. With that practice wand, Alastor began formal training in defensive magic. Not the simple shield charms taught to first-year Hogwarts students, but foundational techniques that would support more complex magic later. He learned to sense incoming spells, to recognize the buildup of magical energy that preceded a curse, to move his body efficiently, to avoid what couldn't be blocked. His mother taught him healing basics alongside these defensive lessons, insisting that knowing how to mend what was broken was as important as knowing how to prevent the break-in in the first place. Defense and healing are two sides of the same coin, Isla would say, guiding her son's small hands through the precise wand movements needed for basic healing charms. Both exist to preserve life. Never forget that, Alastor. All this training, all this vigilance, it's not about being the strongest or the most feared. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. The boy absorbed these lessons, like parched earth absorbs rain, each piece of knowledge finding its place in his growing understanding of magic and its responsibilities. By 9, he could cast a shield charm that would have impressed a third-year student. By 10, he could identify 24 different dark magic signatures by the feel of their magical residue alone. His bedroom became a small library of books on magical theory, defensive spells, and the histories of dark wizards and those who had stopped them. But it wasn't all grim lessons and constant preparation. Isla made sure of that. She took him to the village during market days, let him play with other magical children when they visited, taught him to laugh and find joy in simple things. She showed him that vigilance didn't mean living in constant fear, but rather living with eyes open to both danger and beauty. to both threats and wonders. There were picnics on the moors where they watched the clouds drift by, naming the shapes they saw and making up stories about them. There were evenings when Isla would play the old songs on her fiddle, the traditional melodies of the highlands that spoke of magic and moonlight and ancient times. There were mornings when they would walk to the loch just to watch the sunrise paint the water gold and pink, and Isla would remind him that this beauty was what they fought to protect, that vigilance was an act of love, not just of duty. Yet even these peaceful moments carried lessons. When they picnicked, Alastor learned to choose defensive positions instinctively, sitting where he could see approaching paths. When music filled the house, his father taught him that sounds could mask the approach of enemies, and that one must learn to listen beneath the obvious. When they watched sunrises, Fergus would point out how the changing light could reveal or conceal movement, how shadows could be allies or cover for foes. The defining moment of Alastor's childhood, the incident that would cement his path and deepen his understanding of why constant vigilance truly mattered, came in the winter of his 10th year. Snow had blanketed the highlands in white silence, transforming the familiar moorland into a landscape of pristine beauty and hidden dangers. The Moody family had just finished dinner, the fire crackling warmly, when the wards around the property screamed their warning. Not the gentle chime that announced expected visitors, but the shrieking alarm that meant hostile magic, immediate threat, danger approaching fast. Fergus was on his feet instantly, wand drawn, moving toward the door with the practiced efficiency of someone who had responded to such alarms hundreds of times. Isla grabbed Alastor, pulling him toward the reinforced cellar where the family's emergency protocols dictated he should shelter during attacks. But the boy, 10 years old and already trained beyond his age, resisted. "I can help," he said, his practice wand in his hand, his face pale but determined. "No," Isla said firmly, even as her own wand appeared in her hand. "You shelter. That's your job right now." Outside, through the windows, they could see figures approaching through the snow, 3 of them, moving with purpose, wands raised and glowing with active spells, dark wizards drawn perhaps by Fergus's reputation, or by some grudge, or simply by the knowledge that an Auror's home might contain valuable magical artifacts worth stealing. Fergus met them at the boundary of the inner wards, and the night erupted in flashes of coloured light as spells flew through the falling snow. Isla, despite her own orders to Alastor, couldn't shelter while her husband fought alone. She moved to the window, preparing defensive spells, ready to support him. In that moment, young Alastor made a choice that would echo through his life. He saw his mother's attention fixed on the battle outside, saw the gap in their awareness of the house's interior, and felt, rather than heard, something wrong. Another presence, a 4th attacker, using the distraction of the assault to breach the house from another direction. His heart hammering, Alastor moved quickly but quietly toward the kitchen, where the presence felt strongest. His practice wand felt almost weightless in his sweating palm. He was 10 years old. He had trained extensively but never faced real danger, never cast a spell with the intention of actually stopping another person. The intruder came through the kitchen window in a shower of broken glass and failed wards, a hooded figure moving with practiced stealth. The dark wizard's wand was already rising, a curse forming on his lips, a curse aimed toward the doorway where Isla stood with her back turned, focused on the battle outside. Alastor didn't think. 10 years of training, 10 years of lessons, 10 years of constant vigilance drilled into him by both word and example, all of it compressed into a single moment of perfect clarity. He raised his practice wand and shouted the strongest shield charm he knew, pouring every ounce of his considerable magical power into it. The shield blazed into existence between the intruder and his mother, solid as steel, bright as the sun. The Dark Wizard's curse, later identified as a particularly nasty cutting hex, shattered against it in a shower of sparks. Isla whirled at the sound, saw the intruder, saw her young son standing with his wand raised and his face set in fierce determination, and her own wand was moving before conscious thought directed it. The fight was brief. Fergus, alerted by the commotion inside, abandoned the external battle to his own wards and came crashing through the front door. The three outside attackers, seeing their infiltrator's failure and facing an aura and a trained healer, made the wise choice to disapparate into the snowy night. The intruder in the kitchen, caught between Fergus's fury and Isla's precise spell work, was subdued within moments. When the ministry officials arrived to collect the prisoner and take statements, they found Fergus Moody standing in his damaged kitchen, one arm around his wife, the other resting on his son's shoulder. Alastor stood very still, the adrenaline of the fight draining away, leaving him shaky and pale. But his eyes, those eyes that would one day become legendary for their ability to see through deception, were calm and clear. "The boy saved my life," Isla told the officials quietly. "He sensed the threat when none of us did. 10 years old, and he has the instincts of a seasoned aura." The officials exchanged glances, making notes. One of them, an older wizard with kind eyes, knelt beside Alastor. "That was very brave, young man, and very well done. Your father must be proud." Alastor looked up at Fergus, uncertain. His father's face was unreadable, that stern mask he wore in public firmly in place. But then Fergus's hand tightened on his son's shoulder, and when he spoke, his voice carried a warmth that few outside the family ever heard. "More than proud," Fergus said. "You did exactly what you needed to do, lad. You stayed alert when others were distracted. You recognized the real threat. You acted decisively. That's what constant vigilance means. Not living in fear, but being ready when the moment demands it." Later, after the officials had left and the wards had been repaired and strengthened, after Alastor had finally been allowed to sleep, despite the adrenaline still singing through his veins, Fergus and Isla sat by the fire, speaking in low voices. "He's ready," Fergus said, "or he will be by the time Hogwarts comes." "He's still so young," Isla protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Aye, but the darkness doesn't care about age. You saw what happened tonight. If we'd kept him ignorant, kept him sheltered like a normal child, he'd have frozen in fear instead of acting. Our way, hard as it is, kept you alive." Isla was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames dance. "I just hope," she said, finally, "that all this vigilance, all this constant watching for danger, I hope it doesn't rob him of the ability to see beauty, to trust, to love." "We'll make sure it doesn't," Fergus promised. "We'll teach him that vigilance and love aren't enemies. That watching for threats is how we protect what we cherish." Upstairs, Alastor finally slept, his dreams a confused tangle of snow and spells and the terrible moment when he'd realized his mother was in danger. When he woke in the morning, the winter sun streaming through his window, he felt different, older, changed in some fundamental way. He had faced darkness and not flinched. He had acted when action was needed. He had saved a life, his mother's life, through vigilance and training and the willingness to step forward when easier paths beckoned. The months that followed saw Alastor's training continue with renewed intensity, but also with a new understanding of its purpose. He wasn't learning to fight for fighting's sake, or to gather power for its own reward. He was learning to stand between darkness and those who couldn't defend themselves, to be ready when being ready mattered most. By the time his 11th birthday approached, by the time the letter from Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry arrived on a misty Scottish morning, carried by a great tawny owl, Alastor Moody was already more prepared for the magical world than most students twice his age. He had his mother's compassion and his father's steel, a rare magical sensitivity that let him detect danger others missed, and a growing understanding that constant vigilance wasn't paranoia, it was love in action. The letter sat on the breakfast table, the Hogwarts seal gleaming in the morning light. Alastor stared at it, feeling the weight of the future pressing down on his young shoulders. Hogwarts meant leaving home, leaving the safety of these wards and walls, leaving the constant protection of his parents. It meant entering a wider world where dangers would be less obvious and threats more subtle. But it also meant the next step on a path he could already see stretching before him, as clear as the highlands after rain. A path that would lead through 7 years of magical education, through Auror training, through wars and battles and sacrifices yet unimagined. A path that would eventually transform Alastor Moody from a vigilant boy into the legendary Mad-Eye, defender of the innocent, scourge of dark wizards, and one of the most formidable magical warriors of his age. "Are you ready?" his father asked quietly. Alastor looked up, meeting those stern eyes that had watched over him his entire life, and nodded. "Constant vigilance," he said, and Fergus smiled. The journey to Hogwarts began, as it did for so many young witches and wizards, at King's Cross Station in London. The transition from the wild, windswept highlands to the bustling chaos of the city was jarring for 11-year-old Alastor, though he tried not to show it. His father walked beside him, trunk floating behind them with a simple levitation charm, while his mother held his hand, a gesture he was almost too old for, but didn't quite have the heart to refuse. Platform 9 3/4 revealed itself through the magical barrier, and suddenly they stood in a world of steam and noise and excited chatter. The Hogwarts Express gleamed scarlet in the morning light, its brass fittings polished to perfection, smoke billowing from its funnel in great white clouds. Children ran along the platform, saying tearful goodbyes to parents, hauling trunks and owl cages, calling out to friends they hadn't seen since the previous term. Alastor stood very still, taking it all in, his sharp eyes noting exits and entrances, watching the crowd patterns, observing which families seemed nervous and which seemed confident. Old habits, already deeply ingrained. Fergus noticed his son's assessment and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's all right to just be a child sometimes, lad," he said quietly. "You don't have to watch for threats every moment. Hogwarts is the safest place in Britain. Dumbledore sees to that." Constant vigilance, Alastor replied automatically, but there was a small smile on his face. Isla knelt beside him, straightening his robes unnecessarily, her eyes bright with tears she was trying not to shed. "Remember," she said softly, "all that we've taught you about defense and awareness. Those skills will serve you well. But also remember to make friends, to laugh, to learn things just for the joy of learning them. You're going to Hogwarts to become educated, not just trained." "I know, Mum," Alastor said, and surprised himself by hugging her tightly. Fergus pulled him close as well, and for a moment the stern Auror's mask slipped entirely. "We're proud of you, son. Whatever house claims you, whatever path you walk, we're proud." Then the whistle blew, and it was time to board. Alastor found an empty compartment near the middle of the train, not too close to either end, with a good view of the corridor in both directions, and settled in by the window. He watched his parents on the platform until the train began to move, and they disappeared from view, swallowed by steam and distance. The journey north was a revelation. Other students passed his compartment, some glancing in curiously at the solitary boy with a serious expression. A few asked if they could join him, and Alastor, remembering his mother's words about friendship, nodded awkwardly. Soon his compartment filled with children his own age, some from magical families, others muggle-born and wide-eyed with wonder at every new revelation about the world they were entering. There was a girl named Margaret who talked enthusiastically about her parents' bookshop in Diagon Alley, and a boy called Edmund who came from a long line of Ravenclaws and seemed nervous about maintaining the family tradition. A pair of twins named Flora and Fiona kept finishing each other's sentences and making everyone laugh with their synchronized commentary on passing scenery. Alastor found himself relaxing slightly, drawn into conversation about what they hoped to learn, which houses they might be sorted into, whether the rumors about moving staircases and talking portraits were really true. When the lunch trolley came by, he shared the sweets his mother had packed and discovered that chocolate frogs really did hop, and that collecting famous witches and wizards cards was apparently a serious pursuit. He got Godric Gryffindor on his first try and tucked the card carefully into his pocket. As the train carried them northward, as the landscape shifted from city to countryside to the wild beauty of the Scottish Highlands that Alastor knew so well, he felt something shifting inside himself. Perhaps his father was right. Perhaps it was possible to be vigilant without being isolated, to be prepared without being paranoid, to train for the worst while hoping for the best. When Hogwarts finally came into view across the dark lake, its towers and turrets silhouetted against the star-filled sky, its windows glowing with warm golden light, every child in his compartment pressed close to the windows to stare in wonder. Even Alastor, who had been raised on stories of the castle, who had seen paintings and photographs, who thought himself prepared for anything, even he felt his breath catch at the magnificent sight. The castle sat atop its rocky outcropping like a crown upon a king's head, ancient and powerful and somehow welcoming all at once. Lights flickered in hundreds of windows, and the great lake reflected the castle's image like a dark mirror, doubling its grandeur. It looked like something from a fairy tale, like the illustration in an old book of legends, like magic made manifest in stone and spell. First years over here," called a voice like rolling thunder. and the new students found themselves being shepherded toward a giant of a man who introduced himself as Hagrid, the keeper of keys and grounds. He led them down to the lake's edge, where small boats waited, rocking gently in the water. "No more'n 4 to a boat," Hagrid called, and Alastor found himself sharing a vessel with Margaret, Edmund, and a quiet boy who hadn't said more than 2 words the entire train journey. The boats moved across the lake of their own accord, carrying the first years toward their destiny, while Hagrid sang a somewhat off-key song about Hogwarts in the lead boat. The approach to the castle from the water was even more spectacular than the distant view. The boats carried them into an underground harbour where stone steps led up to enormous oak doors. Professor McGonagall, stern and elegant in her emerald robes, waited to greet them. She explained the house system: Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin, and the importance of the sorting ceremony they were about to undergo. Alastor listened intently, his mind already working through what he knew of each house. Gryffindor valued bravery and daring, qualities his father certainly possessed, though Fergus had been in Hufflepuff, valuing loyalty and hard work above flashy heroics. His mother had been a Ravenclaw, prizing knowledge and wisdom. He didn't know much about Slytherin, except that dark wizards often came from that house, though his father had warned him against judging anyone solely by their house association. "The hat sees what's in your heart," Fergus had told him. "Trust its judgment and make whichever house claims you proud." The great hall took Alastor's breath away completely. The ceiling, enchanted to reflect the sky outside, showed the same stars he'd watched from his Highland home, but somehow more vivid, more immediate. Thousands of candles floated in midair, casting warm light over 4 long house tables, where older students sat watching the new arrivals with interest. At the head of the hall, the staff table held professors in their formal robes, and at its center sat a wizard with a long silver beard and twinkling eyes, Albus Dumbledore, the greatest wizard of the age. The sorting hat sat on a stool, patched and frayed, and somehow dignified despite its worn appearance. As Professor McGonagall began calling names alphabetically, Alastor watched student after student approach the stool, the hat placed on their heads. A moment of deliberation, and then the announcement of their house to cheers from the appropriate table. Moody, Alastor. His heart hammered as he walked forward, aware of hundreds of eyes upon him. He sat on the stool, and Professor McGonagall lowered the hat onto his head. Instantly, a voice spoke in his mind, dry, amused, ancient. "Ah, a Moody," the hat said. "I remember your father, young man. Fine wizard, that one. Hufflepuff suited him well, though he had courage enough for Gryffindor. And your mother, brilliant mind, belonged in Ravenclaw without question. But you're an interesting case." Alastor waited, barely breathing. "Plenty of courage here. Oh yes. More than enough for Gryffindor. You'd face down a dragon if you thought it was threatening someone you cared about. But there's calculation too, strategy, a mind that plans 3 moves ahead. Ravenclaw would appreciate that, and loyalty, deep loyalty to those you deem worthy, to causes you believe in. Hufflepuff would welcome you. Where do I belong?" Alastor thought at the hat. "Where you'll grow most, I think. Where you'll be challenged and supported in equal measure. Where courage meets purpose. Where bravery serves a higher calling. where the fight against darkness begins with the courage to stand when others flee. The hat paused, then shouted aloud, "Gryffindor!" The Gryffindor table erupted in cheers, and Alastor walked toward it on slightly shaky legs. Hands reached out to clap his shoulders. Voices welcomed him. Space was made for him at the bench. He sat down, looking back to see Margaret sorted into Ravenclaw, Edmund joining her there with visible relief, the quiet boy from his boat going to Hufflepuff. The feast that followed was beyond anything Alastor had experienced. Platters laden with every food imaginable appeared on the tables. Roasted meats and vegetables, pies and pastries, puddings and cakes. He filled his plate, listening to the older students around him talk about classes and professors, Quidditch and the upcoming year. A prefect with kind eyes introduced himself as Thomas and explained some of the basics of Gryffindor house life. Their dormitories were in Gryffindor Tower, accessed through a portrait of the fat lady who required a password. They'd have classes with students from other houses, meals in the Great Hall, and a house pride to maintain through good behavior and academic achievement. And watch out for the tricksters on the way to the astronomy tower, Thomas added with a grin. They like to catch first years on Wednesdays. That night, after the feast concluded, and Dumbledore had made various announcements that seemed designed to both inform and gently terrify the new students, the Gryffindors made their way up to their tower. The castle was a maze of moving staircases, talking portraits, and corridors that didn't always lead where they appeared to go. Alastor made careful mental notes of landmarks and turns, already beginning to map the castle in his mind. The Gryffindor common room was magnificent, circular, with high ceilings, comfortable squashy armchairs arranged around a roaring fireplace, tapestries showing famous Gryffindors on the walls, and windows that looked out over the grounds. It felt warm and welcoming, a place where courage and camaraderie mixed freely. The first-year boys' dormitory was up a spiral staircase, a round room with 5 four-poster beds hung with deep red velvet curtains. Alastor's trunk had already been brought up and sat at the foot of one bed. His roommates were an eclectic group, a boy named William, who talked constantly about Quidditch, another called James, who seemed shy but friendly, a boisterous lad named Frederick, and a serious boy named Christopher, who looked as though he'd rather be reading than talking. As they prepared for bed, the conversation flowed around comfortable subjects, wonder at the castle, excitement about classes starting tomorrow, speculation about which professors would be strict or lenient. Alastor participated quietly, still taking the measure of these boys who would share his dormitory for the next 7 years. When the lights finally went out and silence settled over the room, Alastor lay in his 4-poster bed, curtains pulled back so he could see the room, and felt the strangeness of being away from home for the first time in his life. The bed was comfortable, the room secure. His housemates seemed decent enough. But it wasn't the Highland house with its protective wards and watchful portraits. Wasn't his mother's voice singing softly downstairs, or his father's steady presence checking the perimeter before bed. He pulled the Godric Gryffindor card from his pocket and studied it in the moonlight, filtering through the windows. The founder stared back at him, noble and fierce, sword in hand. The card's description listed Gryffindor's achievements, his courage, his defense of Hogwarts, his stand against dark magic in an age when such magic ran rampant. "I'll make you proud," Alastor whispered to the card, to his parents, to himself. "I'll be ready when darkness comes." Constant vigilance. Then he tucked the card safely away, closed his eyes, and let sleep claim him. The next morning began his true education in magic. His first class was Transfiguration with Professor Dumbledore himself. The deputy headmaster taught this subject before he would later become headmaster. The classroom was already full when Alastor arrived, students nervous and excited in equal measure. When Dumbledore entered, there was an immediate hush. The professor was younger then, his beard not yet the silver waterfall it would become, but already there was something in his eyes, a depth of knowledge and power barely concealed, a twinkle that suggested he found the world endlessly amusing, a weight of responsibility he carried with grace. "Transfiguration," Dumbledore began, his voice warm and resonant, "is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts. Anyone messing around in my class will leave and not come back. You have been warned." Then he smiled, and the tension broke like a snapping thread. However, for those willing to apply themselves with dedication and care, there is no branch of magic more rewarding. To change the fundamental nature of one thing into another requires understanding not just spells, but the deep structure of reality itself. You will, in essence, be learning to rewrite the world. Alastor was entranced. This was magic not just as a tool for defense or attack, but as a way of understanding existence itself. He leaned forward, quill ready, determined to absorb every word. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm both demanding and exhilarating. Charms with tiny Professor Flitwick, who stood on stacks of books to see over his desk, and made learning seem like the most joyful pursuit in the world. Potions in the dungeons with Professor Slughorn, who was already beginning his habit of collecting talented students like precious stones, and who watched Alastor with interest when the boy demonstrated unusual precision in his brewing. Defense against the dark arts was taught by Professor Merrythought, a witch of advancing years but undimmed skill, who had been teaching the subject for decades. It was in her classroom that Alastor truly came alive, his years of preparation at home finally finding proper context and expansion. While other students struggled with the basic shield charm, Alastor performed it flawlessly on the first attempt, earning raised eyebrows from Professor Merrythought and respect from his classmates. "Mr. Moody," she said after class one day, "you have clearly had some prior instruction in defensive magic. Quite advanced instruction, if I'm not mistaken." "Yes, Professor," Alastor confirmed. "My father is an Auror. He's been training me since I was old enough to hold a wand." "I see. Well, don't let that make you complacent. There is always more to learn, and often the students who arrive thinking they know everything are the ones most shocked when they discover how much they don't know." "Constant vigilance, Professor," Alastor said seriously. "My father taught me that too." Professor Merrythought smiled. A wise philosophy for any wizard, but especially for one intending to follow in his father's footsteps. "I suspect we'll be seeing great things from you, Mr. Moody. Just make sure you balance that vigilance with wisdom and that dedication with joy in learning." Outside of classes, Alastor gradually found his place in Gryffindor House. He wasn't the most popular student. His serious nature and tendency to notice things others missed sometimes made his housemates uncomfortable. but he earned respect through his skill, his willingness to help others with difficult homework, and his quiet reliability. When he said he would do something, it was done. When he gave his word, it was kept. He made friends, though perhaps not in the easy, casual way some students did. There was a 6-year girl named Agnes who took him under her wing after he helped her locate a lost book in the library, teaching him shortcuts through the castle and warning him about which corridors to avoid during full moons. A 3rd-year boy named Robert, who had ambitions of becoming an Auror himself, often asked Alastor about his father's work, and the two would spend hours discussing defensive strategies. The library became one of his favorite places. Madame Pince, the librarian, initially regarded him with the same suspicion she showed all students. But when she realized he treated books with genuine respect and returned them in better condition than he'd found them, she began steering him toward volumes that might interest him, particularly older texts on magical theory and defensive applications. Alastor Moody graduated from Hogwarts in the summer of 1939, just as the world, both magical and muggle, stood on the precipice of unprecedented darkness. He had excelled in his NEWT examinations, earning outstanding marks in defense against the dark arts, transfiguration, and charms, with exceeds expectations in everything else. Professor Merrythought had written him a glowing recommendation for the Auror training program, and Professor Dumbledore himself had penned a letter describing young Alastor as one of the most naturally gifted defensive practitioners I have had the privilege to teach. The day after graduation, 18-year-old Alastor stood in his family's Highland home, his Hogwarts trunk unpacked, his future stretching before him with both clarity and uncertainty. The path was obvious. He would apply to the Auror Academy, follow in his father's footsteps, dedicate his life to fighting dark magic. But the world into which he would step was shifting, changing, growing more dangerous by the day. Gellert Grindelwald's power was reaching its zenith on the European continent. His rhetoric of wizard supremacy, of ending the statute of secrecy and ruling over muggles for the greater good, had seduced thousands to his banner. Dark marks were appearing in the skies over Eastern European villages. Wizards and witches who opposed him were disappearing, and everyone knew, though few spoke it aloud, that eventually Britain would not be able to remain isolated from the conflict. Fergus Moody sat with his son by the fire that evening, both of them nursing cups of strong tea, the summer light fading slowly beyond the windows. The older Auror looked tired, more tired than Alastor remembered, with new lines around his eyes and grey threading more heavily through his hair. "You don't have to rush into this," Fergus said quietly. "The Auror Academy will still be there in a year or two. You could take time, travel, explore other aspects of magic before committing to this path." Alastor looked at his father in surprise. "You've been preparing me for this my entire life." I have. And maybe that was wrong of me. Maybe I pushed you toward this because it's what I know, what I understand. But the world's getting darker, son. War is coming. Everyone can feel it. If you join the Aurors now, you'll be walking straight into the teeth of it. "Isn't that exactly when good wizards are needed most?" Alastor asked. "When darkness rises, someone has to stand against it." Fergus smiled sadly. "You sound like your mother." and like Dumbledore, for that matter, both of them with their noble certainties about right and wrong. He paused, staring into the fire. I've fought dark wizards for 30 years, Alastor. I've seen things that would give you nightmares. I've lost friends, watched good people die, seen what dark magic can do to both victims and perpetrators. It's a hard life, a lonely one often. And once you start down this path, it changes you in ways that can never be undone. You're not trying to talk me out of it, are you? Alastor asked. No, Fergus admitted, because I know it wouldn't work, and because despite everything, I believe it's work that needs doing. I just want you to go into it with your eyes open, to understand that constant vigilance isn't just a catchy phrase. It's a way of life that will set you apart from normal people, that will make it hard to trust, hard to rest, hard to love without fear. They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the flames dance. I'm ready, Alastor said finally, or I will be. Teach me everything you can before the academy starts, everything you've held back, thinking I was too young or not ready. I need to know it all. And so began the most intensive 3 months of training Alastor had ever experienced. Fergus, accepting his son's decision, threw himself into preparing Alastor for what was to come. They rose before dawn each day, practicing dueling techniques in the glen while the mist still clung to the heather. Fergus taught him not just spells, but strategy. How to read an opponent's body language, how to anticipate attacks, how to use terrain to advantage, how to fight dirty when survival demanded it. Honorable dueling is for tournaments, Fergus said, deflecting Alastor's stunning spell and countering with a curse that sent his son sprawling. In the real world, dark wizards don't bow before they attack. They strike from shadows, use hostages, fight in groups. You need to be ready for anything. Isla contributed her own lessons, teaching Alastor advanced healing techniques he would need when help was far away and injuries severe. She taught him to recognize the symptoms of various curses and poisons, how to stabilize someone long enough to get them to proper treatment, how to keep his own head clear when surrounded by blood and screaming. The hardest part, she told him one evening, her hands guiding his through a complex healing charm, will be accepting that you can't save everyone. You'll try. Merlin knows you'll try. But sometimes the injury is too severe, the curse too strong, the distance too great. You'll have to learn to grieve quickly and keep moving. It's a terrible thing to learn, but necessary. When September came, Alastor travelled to London and presented himself at the Ministry of Magic for the beginning of Auror training. The Academy accepted only the best. Out of hundreds of applicants each year, perhaps a dozen were chosen. That year's class consisted of 11 trainees, all recent Hogwarts graduates, all top of their classes, all burning with a desire to fight dark magic. There was Arabella Jorkins, a fierce witch who had been head girl at Hogwarts and whose stunning spell could drop a troll. Marcus Belby, whose family had produced auras for 5 generations and who approached training with grim determination. Prudence Cresswell, quieter than the others, but with a gift for tracking magic that bordered on the supernatural. And 8 others, each talented in their own way, each believing themselves ready for what was to come. The training was brutal. 3 years of intensive study in everything, from combat magic to magical lore, from investigative techniques to undercover operations. They learned to fight in every conceivable situation, in darkness, in water, in enclosed spaces, against multiple opponents. They studied the most dangerous dark spells, not to use them, but to recognize and counter them. They memorized the faces and methods of known dark wizards. They practiced interrogation and investigation, learned to see through disguises and deceptions, trained their minds to resist the imperious curse and their bodies to withstand torture. Alastor excelled, but so did most of his classmates. These were the best young witches and wizards Britain had produced, and the instructors, veteran Aurors who had seen decades of service, pushed them relentlessly. The first year alone saw 3 trainees drop out, unable to handle the physical and mental demands. It was during his second year of training that Alastor had his first real encounter with the darkness he'd been preparing to fight. The trainees were occasionally brought along on actual missions as observers to see how classroom theory translated to fieldwork. Alastor was partnered with a veteran Auror named Dawlish Sr., a grizzled wizard with more scars than smiles, to investigate reports of dark magic activity in a small village in Cornwall. They arrived at dusk, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple, the village seemingly peaceful. But Alastor felt it immediately, that same wrongness he'd sensed as a child, the taint of dark magic polluting the natural magical field. He mentioned it to Dawlish, who nodded approvingly. Good instincts. There's a wizard here who's been experimenting with inferi, reanimated corpses. We're here to shut him down before he can complete whatever he's planning. The mission went wrong almost immediately. The dark wizard had anticipated ministry interference and had set traps. Complex, vicious magical traps that Dawlish barely managed to shield against. Then the inferi came, shambling from the shadows, dead eyes glowing with borrowed magic, rotting hands reaching with terrible strength. Dawlish fought magnificently, his spells precise and devastating, fire blooming from his wand to engulf the corpses. But there were too many, and the dark wizard himself joined the fight, emerging from a concealed cellar with curses flying from his wand. Alastor, technically there only to observe, made a split-second decision. He raised his wand and cast every defensive and offensive spell his training had taught him. His shield charm deflected a curse meant for Dawlish's back. His blasting hex destroyed 3 inferi advancing on their position. His stunning spell, powered by adrenaline and desperate need, caught the dark wizard mid-incantation and sent him crashing into a wall. The fight ended with the dark wizard subdued and the inferi reduced to ash. Dawlish stood among the wreckage, breathing hard, and turned to look at Alastor with new respect. "You're supposed to be observing," he said dryly. "Would you have preferred I observed you getting cursed in the back?" Alastor replied, surprised by his own boldness. Dawlish laughed, a rough, rusty sound. "No, lad. No, I wouldn't have. You've got good instincts and better reflexes. You'll make a fine Auror if you survive the training." But that night, alone in a ministry safe house, while Dawlish finalized paperwork, Alastor found his hands shaking. He had faced inferi, corpses animated by dark magic, things that shouldn't exist but did. He had seen dark magic at its most perverse, life twisted into a mockery of itself. And he had learned that his father was right. Seeing such things changed you in ways that couldn't be undone. He wrote a long letter to his parents that night, describing the mission, the darkness he'd witnessed, the choice he'd made to fight, rather than merely observe. He told them he was all right, which was mostly true. He told them he was certain of his path, which was completely true. He didn't tell them about the nightmares that would haunt him for weeks. Images of dead eyes and grasping hands that woke him, gasping in the dark. The training continued. Third year brought even more intense practical experience, more missions, more exposure to the reality of dark magics spread through Britain and beyond. Grindelwald's war was escalating, and while he hadn't yet turned his full attention to Britain, his influence was spreading like poison through water. Dark wizards, emboldened by his rhetoric, were emerging from shadows, committing crimes that had been rare only years before. Alastor graduated from the Auror Academy in 1942, top of his class, with commendations for combat proficiency and investigative skill. He was 21 years old, already hardened by 3 years of intensive training and the missions he'd undertaken. The ceremony was small. The ministry didn't advertise its auras, didn't parade them for public acclaim. They worked in shadows, and shadows were where they remained. But Fergus was there, standing at the back of the room, and when Alastor received his official Auror badge, a small golden shield that would identify him to other ministry officials, he saw pride shining in his father's eyes. "You've done well, son," Fergus said simply, shaking his hand. "Now the real work begins." He was assigned to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's Auror office, working under the command of head Auror Theseus Scamander. His first solo mission came within a week, tracking a wizard who had been using the Imperious Curse to rob Gringotts customers. It was a relatively simple case, the kind used to ease new auras into fieldwork, but Alastor approached it with the same meticulous care he would bring to every mission for the rest of his career. He spent days observing the target, learning his patterns, identifying his associates. He examined the crime scenes, interviewed witnesses, pieced together a picture of the wizard's methods and motivations. When he finally made his move, it was swift and decisive, catching the criminal in the act, shield charm already in place to deflect the desperate Imperious attempt, stunning spell, perfectly aimed. The arrest was clean, the evidence solid. Theseus Scamander called him into his office the next day. "Good work, Moody," the head Auror said, reviewing the case file. "Thorough, patient, effective. No unnecessary force, no procedural mistakes. This is exactly the kind of work we need." "Thank you, sir," Alastor replied, standing at attention. "At ease, lad. You're not in training anymore." Scamander leaned back in his chair, studying the young Auror. "I've been reading your academy reports. Your instructors say you have exceptional instincts for detecting dark magic, superior combat skills, and a tendency toward paranoia that borders on obsessive. Constant vigilance, sir. My father's philosophy. A good philosophy for an Auror. Just make sure it doesn't consume you entirely. The best Aurors I've known maintained balance. They could be ruthlessly vigilant on duty and still find moments of peace off duty. The ones who couldn't separate work from life usually burned out or went mad. It was advice Alastor would remember, but struggle to follow for the rest of his life. The years that followed were a blur of cases and missions, each one adding to his growing reputation as a skilled and dedicated Auror. He tracked dark wizards through the twisting streets of Nocturne Alley, investigated mysterious disappearances in remote villages, dismantled dark artifact smuggling rings, and faced dangers that would have given most wizards nightmares. he developed his signature style: thorough preparation, constant awareness, multiple backup plans, and overwhelming force when necessary. He learned to trust his instincts above all else, to notice the details others missed, to question everything that seemed too convenient or too simple. And he began to collect scars. A curse that sliced his left arm during a raid on a dark wizard's hideout left a jagged white line from shoulder to elbow. A near miss with a blasting hex left burn marks across his ribs. A dark artifact that exploded during investigation peppered his face with small scars that would fade but never fully disappear. His parents watched with mixed pride and worry as their son threw himself into his work with single-minded dedication. Alastor worried that he was isolating himself, that the darkness he fought daily was seeping into his soul. Fergus understood better than anyone the demands of the job, but still counseled his son to find moments of light amid the shadow. "You need more than just work, lad," Fergus told him during a rare visit home. "Friends, interests, maybe even, Merlin help us, a romantic relationship. Something to remind you what you're fighting for." Alastor had smiled at that, a rare expression that made him look younger than his years. "I know what I'm fighting for, Dar. Every family that sleeps safely because we caught a dark wizard before he could hurt them. Every child who grows up never knowing the darkness we keep at bay. That's enough. For now, perhaps," Fergus said quietly. "But someday you'll wake up and realize you've spent so much time preventing others' pain that you've forgotten how to feel joy yourself. Don't let that happen, Alastor. Don't let the fight consume everything you are." But the fight was consuming, especially as the 1940s progressed and Grindelwald's power reached its terrible peak. Though the Dark Wizard's primary focus remained on continental Europe, his influence touched Britain as well. Wizards who sympathized with his ideology began committing crimes in his name. Dark artifacts flooded into the country. Tensions rose within the magical community between those who supported the Statute of Secrecy and those who believed in Grindelwald's vision of wizard supremacy. Alastor worked longer hours, took on more dangerous assignments, pushed himself harder than ever. He was building a reputation. Moody, the Auror who never gave up, who saw through deceptions, who could track a dark wizard through hell itself if necessary. But he was also building walls around himself, letting the vigilance that served him so well professionally bleed into every aspect of his life. It was during this period, in 1945, that Alastor received news that would shake him to his core. His father, Fergus Moody, had been killed in the line of duty. A mission gone wrong, an ambush by dark wizards who had been waiting specifically for him. A curse that had struck before even his legendary vigilance could save him. Alastor travelled home to the Highlands in numb shock, barely registering the journey. The house felt empty without his father's presence. The protective wards somehow less substantial. The portraits on the walls grieving in their painted frames. His mother, devastated but strong, held him while he wept for the first time since childhood. "He died fighting for what he believed in," Isla said, her own voice breaking. "Fighting darkness, protecting innocence. He wouldn't have wanted it any other way." "He should have been more careful," Alastor said bitterly. "Should have been more vigilant, taken more precautions." "Stop," Isla said firmly. "Your father was one of the most careful, vigilant Aurors who ever lived. Sometimes darkness wins anyway. Sometimes Good wizards die despite doing everything right. You know this, Alastor. You've seen it yourself. The funeral was attended by dozens of Aurors, current and retired, all coming to pay respects to a man who had served with honor for nearly 4 decades. Theseus Scamander himself gave the eulogy, speaking of Fergus Moody's dedication, skill, and the countless lives he had saved. But it was Albus Dumbledore's words, spoken quietly to Alastor after the ceremony, that would echo through the years. "Your father was a great wizard and a good man," Dumbledore said, his blue eyes filled with genuine sorrow. "The world is diminished by his loss. But his legacy lives on in you, Alastor, and in every dark wizard he prevented from causing harm, and in every Auror he trained or inspired. That is a powerful magic, legacy, more powerful than any spell." Alastor returned to work a week later, driven by grief and determination. He threw himself into his cases with renewed intensity, as if by saving others he could somehow honor his father's sacrifice. His reputation grew. Moody, they called him, sometimes Mad-Eye even then, for the way his gaze seemed to see through walls and lies. The Auror who never slept, who never stopped hunting, who brought dark wizards to justice no matter how long it took or what it cost. The defeat of Grindelwald in 1945 brought a sense of relief to the magical world, a collective exhaling of breath held too long. Albus Dumbledore's legendary duel with the Dark Wizard became the stuff of instant legend, and for a time it seemed that perhaps the darkest days were behind them. The Auror office, which had swelled to unprecedented numbers during Grindelwald's terror, began to return to more routine operations, tracking common criminals, investigating dark artifact smuggling, maintaining the peace that good wizards and witches had fought so hard to secure. Alastor Moody, now in his mid-20s, had become one of the department's most effective and dedicated Aurors. The loss of his father had hardened something inside him, refined his vigilance into an almost supernatural awareness. He seemed to sense danger before it manifested, to see through disguises and deceptions that fooled others, to track dark wizards with an almost preternatural instinct. His colleagues respected him, though few could claim to truly know him. He was professional, reliable, brilliant at his work, but kept himself apart from the casual friendships and office politics that others engaged in. He would share a drink with fellow Aurors after a successful mission, would offer advice or assistance when asked, but there was always a distance, a part of himself he kept carefully guarded. "Moody doesn't trust anyone," one young Auror complained to Theseus Scamander after a joint operation where Alastor had insisted on triple-checking everyone's credentials and backup plans. Scamander had smiled grimly. "Moody doesn't trust anyone because he's seen too many times what happens when you trust the wrong person. His paranoia has saved more lives than your optimism ever will. Learn from him, or at least try not to get in his way." The 1950s and 60s passed in what seemed like relative quiet, though darkness never truly sleeps. It merely waits, gathering strength, choosing its moment. Alastor continued his work, rising through the ranks, earning commendation after commendation. He developed new investigative techniques, trained younger Aurors, and built a network of informants throughout the magical underworld that fed him information on dark magic activities. He also began collecting magical artifacts for defense, not dark objects, but tools that could help him in his constant war against darkness. a mirror that showed the truth of disguised faces, a compass that pointed toward the nearest source of dark magic, small objects, carefully chosen, that augmented his already formidable abilities. His mother, growing older in the Highland house, worried about him during his infrequent visits home. He seemed wound tighter each year, more suspicious, more isolated. The warm boy who had once laughed and played in the heather was buried deep beneath layers of vigilance and hard-won experience. "You need to let someone in, Alastor," Isla told him one evening, her healing hands gentle on his face as she examined new scars from a recent mission. "You're building walls so high that one day you'll wake up and realize you're trapped inside them." "The walls keep me safe, Mum," he replied. "They keep me alert. In my line of work, letting your guard down for even a moment can mean death. There's a difference between being careful and being completely closed off," she insisted. "Your father was vigilant, yes, but he also had love, had friendship, had me. Those connections didn't make him weaker. They made him stronger. They gave him something to fight for beyond just duty." Alastor had no answer for that, because deep down, he knew she was right. But he also knew that caring for people meant risking the pain of losing them, and he had already lost enough. The turning point came in the late 1960s, when whispers began to spread through the magical community about a new dark wizard. The name was spoken in hushed tones, often with fear: Lord Voldemort. At first, the reports were scattered and unclear. Dark marks appearing in the sky, families disappearing, rumors of a wizard who had delved into magic so dark it defied comprehension. The Auror office initially treated these reports as they would any dark wizard activity, with concern and attention, but not panic. Dark wizards rose periodically. They always had. Most were caught or killed before they could do significant damage. The ministry had systems in place, trained Aurors, established procedures. But Alastor, reading the reports with his characteristic thoroughness, felt a cold certainty settling in his bones. This was different. The pattern of attacks, the sophistication of the magic involved, the way witnesses described a wizard of terrible power and even more terrible ambition. It reminded him too much of the stories his father had told about the early days of Grindelwald's rise. He brought his concerns to his superiors, argued for more resources, more attention to this emerging threat. But the ministry, grown comfortable in the decades since Grindelwald's fall, was slow to act. Bureaucracy moved at its own pace, and many officials were reluctant to believe that another dark wizard of truly dangerous power could be rising so soon after the last. "You're being paranoid, Moody," one ministry official told him dismissively. "One dark wizard making trouble doesn't mean we're facing another Grindelwald. We have Aurors investigating. We'll handle it. By the time you finish investigating through proper channels," Alastor replied coldly, "this dark wizard will have killed dozens more innocents. I know the signs. I've studied dark wizards my entire life. This one is different, more dangerous." But his warnings fell on deaf ears, at least within the official ministry hierarchy. However, there was one person who took Alastor's concerns very seriously indeed: Albus Dumbledore. The headmaster of Hogwarts had been watching the rise of Tom Riddle, now calling himself Lord Voldemort, with deep concern. Dumbledore had taught the boy, had seen the seeds of darkness in him even then, and had witnessed with growing alarm as those seeds had grown into something monstrous. When Alastor requested a meeting with him in the winter of 1970, Dumbledore agreed immediately. They met in the headmaster's office at Hogwarts, that circular room filled with delicate silver instruments and sleeping portraits of previous headmasters. Fawkes, Dumbledore's phoenix, regarded Alastor with bright, knowing eyes from his perch. "Auror Moody," Dumbledore said warmly, gesturing to a comfortable chair. "It has been too long. I trust you are well." "Well enough, sir," Alastor replied, though his scarred face and tired eyes suggested otherwise. "I've come because I need to speak with someone who will take the threat of this new dark wizard seriously. The Ministry won't listen, but I am hoping you will." "I am listening," Dumbledore said, his expression growing grave. "And I share your concerns more than you know. Tell me what you have learned." For the next 2 hours, Alastor laid out everything he had gathered, reports of attacks, patterns he had identified, the escalating nature of the violence, the growing number of disappearances. He described how Voldemort seemed to be gathering followers, promising power to those who joined him and dealing death to those who opposed him. "He's building an army," Alastor concluded, "not just recruiting a few followers, but systematically gathering dark wizards, offering them something worth dying for. And he's not just powerful himself. He's strategic, patient, willing to work in shadows until he's strong enough to strike openly. By the time the Ministry realizes the scope of the threat, it will be too late." Dumbledore was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his blue eyes distant and troubled. Finally, he spoke. "You are correct in every particular, Alastor. Tom Riddle, for that is his true name, is perhaps the most dangerous dark wizard since Grindelwald, and in some ways more dangerous still. He has gone further into dark magic than almost any wizard in history, seeking immortality through means so vile I hesitate to speak of them. And you are also correct that the Ministry will not act until it is far too late." "Then what do we do?" Alastor asked. "If the official channels won't work, if the Ministry won't mobilize, then we must work outside official channels," Dumbledore said quietly. "I have been considering forming a group, a secret society of witches and wizards dedicated to fighting Voldemort and his Death Eaters. Not sanctioned by the Ministry, not bound by their bureaucracy or politics, simply good people willing to stand against darkness. An underground resistance," Alastor said, understanding immediately. "Operating in the shadows, doing what needs to be done." "Precisely. I call it the Order of the Phoenix, named for Fawkes here, who represents the hope of rebirth and renewal, even from ashes." Dumbledore leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I would be honored if you would join us, Alastor. Your skills, your experience, your unfailing vigilance. We will need all of it in the days to come." Alastor didn't hesitate. "I'm in. Whatever you need, whenever you need it. This is what I've trained for my entire life." And so Alastor Moody became one of the founding members of the Order of the Phoenix, joining a group that would include some of the bravest witches and wizards of their generation. There were Aurors like himself, good people frustrated by the Ministry's inaction. There were Hogwarts professors who understood that some battles couldn't be fought in classrooms. There were ordinary witches and wizards who simply refused to stand by while darkness consumed their world. The Order's headquarters was established at number 12, Grimmauld Place, the ancestral home of the Black family. offered by Sirius Black's parents before their son's later rebellion. The house was protected by every concealment charm and defensive ward Dumbledore and the other members could devise, hidden from the world, a sanctuary where they could plan and prepare. The first time Alastor attended an order meeting, walking through that grim, dark house with its troll-leg umbrella stand and its portrait of Sirius's mother before it was permanently stuck to the wall, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose shared with others, of not being alone in the fight. Around the long table in the kitchen sat perhaps 20 witches and wizards, their faces grave but determined. There was Elphias Doge, Dumbledore's old friend, his loyalty absolute despite his somewhat timid appearance. Daedalus Diggle, enthusiastic and brave despite lacking Alastor's combat experience. Marlene McKinnon, fierce and skilled, from a family known for producing powerful witches. Caradoc Dearborn, brilliant with strategy and planning. Edgar Bones, solid and dependable. His sister Amelia already showing signs of becoming an outstanding witch. And there were others. Some Alastor knew from Auror work, others he met for the first time that night, each bringing their own skills, their own determination, their own reasons for joining the fight. Dumbledore stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding despite his gentle demeanor. "My friends," he began, "we gather here tonight because we see a darkness rising that threatens everything we hold dear. Lord Voldemort and his Death Eaters are growing bolder, and the Ministry remains blind to the true scope of the danger. We few must stand against him, must fight in ways the Ministry cannot or will not. This will be dangerous work. Some of us may not survive it, but it is necessary work, and I am honored to stand with each of you." The war began slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. Small skirmishes, intelligence gathering, protective missions. The Order worked to counter Death Eater attacks, to protect families targeted for their blood status or their opposition to Voldemort, to gather information about the Dark Wizard's movements and plans. Alastor threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity. He developed security protocols for Order members, taught defensive techniques, planned missions with meticulous care. His paranoia, which some had considered excessive, now seemed prescient. He insisted on secret keepers for important locations, on constant vigilance against infiltration, on backup plans for every operation. Constant vigilance became his battle cry, shouted at meetings, drilled into younger Order members, repeated until it became almost a joke. Except it wasn't a joke. It was deadly serious advice that saved lives. The battles came more frequently as the 1970s progressed and Voldemort's power grew. Alastor fought in dozens of engagements, facing Death Eaters in back alleys and ruined buildings, in forests and abandoned warehouses. His dueling skills, already formidable, were honed to a razor's edge by constant practice and necessity. He developed a reputation among the Death Eaters. Mad-Eye Moody, they called him, the paranoid Auror who seemed to have eyes everywhere, who anticipated ambushes before they were sprung, who never fell for the same trick twice. They learned to fear him, and that fear was well earned. Alastor had personally captured more Death Eaters than any other Auror, had disrupted countless operations, had saved dozens of lives through his vigilance and skill, but the war also extracted its terrible price. Order members began to fall. Good people, brave people, friends and colleagues cut down by killing curses, or overwhelmed by superior numbers. Each death hit Alastor hard, confirming his belief that letting people get close meant inevitable pain. Marlene McKinnon and her entire family murdered by Death Eaters in a coordinated attack that left their house a smoking ruin. Caradoc Dearborn, who disappeared on a mission and was never found, his fate unknown but presumed tragic. Dorcas Meadows, killed personally by Voldemort himself, her skill and bravery insufficient against such terrible power. After each loss, Alastor would retreat into himself, become even more focused on security, on preparation, on preventing the next death through better planning and more careful vigilance. His drinking increased. Fire whiskey to dull the nightmares, to quiet the voices of friends who no longer answered when called. It was during a mission in 1976 that Alastor suffered the injury that would define his appearance for the rest of his life. The Order had received intelligence about a Death Eater meeting in a supposedly abandoned manor house outside London. Alastor led a team to investigate. Himself, 2 other Aurors, and a young Order member eager to prove himself. The intelligence was good. The Death Eaters were indeed meeting there. But what the intelligence hadn't revealed was that they were expecting the Order, that the meeting was bait for a trap, that the manor was rigged with dark magic designed to kill or maim anyone who entered. The trap was sprung the moment they crossed the threshold. Curses flew from hidden positions, dark spells that had been carefully prepared and positioned for maximum devastation. Alastor's shield went up instantly, protecting himself and shouting warnings to his team. But there were too many attackers, too many angles of assault. A curse clipped his left leg, dark magic burning through flesh and shattering bone. Alastor went down, still casting shield charms, still trying to cover his team's retreat. Another spell struck his face. He felt his eye explode in a flash of agonizing pain, felt blood streaming down his cheek, felt the world suddenly become half blind. Through the pain, through the blood, through the chaos of battle, Alastor kept fighting. His wand never wavered. His spells never stopped. He couldn't see properly, could barely stand. But he would be damned if he'd let Death Eaters kill his team because he couldn't push through pain. The other Aurors managed to get the young Order member out, then came back for Alastor, dragging him through curses and hexes, his blood leaving a trail across the manor's floor. They apparated to St. Mungo's, where healers swarmed around Alastor's broken body, working frantically to stabilize him. He woke 3 days later in a hospital bed, his mother sitting beside him, her face etched with worry. His left leg was gone below the knee, replaced by a wooden prosthetic the healers had attached. His left eye was gone entirely, covered by a bandage that would remain until the socket healed enough for a magical replacement. "You're alive," Isla said, her voice breaking. "Merlin, help us, Alastor. You're alive." The healers said it was the closest thing they'd ever seen. Another minute, and you'd have bled out. "The team?" Alastor asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Safe, thanks to you. You held off a dozen Death Eaters long enough for them to escape. The boy you saved, he's calling you a hero." "Not a hero," Alastor muttered, trying to sit up and failing. "Just did my job." "Your job nearly killed you," Isla said, gripping his hand tightly. "Maybe it's time to consider—" "No," Alastor cut her off. "Don't even say it. This is what I do. This is who I am. I'm not stopping because of a leg and an eye. I'm not letting those Death Eater bastards win. And he didn't. During his recovery, he worked with the finest magical artificers in Britain to create a magical eye, a brilliant blue sphere that could rotate independently of his remaining natural eye, that could see through invisibility cloaks and solid objects, that could look backward while he looked forward. It was uncomfortable, occasionally painful, and made him look unsettling to those who didn't know him. But it gave him an advantage, made him even more effective at detecting threats and seeing through deceptions. The wooden leg was replaced with a better prosthetic, one that could be manipulated like a real limb through magic, though it gave him a distinctive clunking gait. He learned to fight with it, to move efficiently despite the disability, to turn what could have been a weakness into just another part of his arsenal. When he returned to active duty 6 months after the attack, scarred and changed, but unbroken, the Death Eaters learned that Mad-Eye Moody was even more dangerous than before. He could see them coming now, could detect them through their disguises, could anticipate their movements with his enhanced perception. His reputation grew from fearsome to legendary. The war intensified through the late 1970s. Voldemort was growing bolder, his Death Eaters striking openly. The Ministry finally forced to acknowledge the threat, but struggling to respond effectively. The Order of the Phoenix became increasingly vital, operating where the Ministry couldn't or wouldn't, fighting battles that never made the papers, saving lives that would never know how close they came to death. One mission Alastor would remember until his dying day occurred in the autumn of 1979. The Order received intelligence that Death Eaters were planning to attack the Longbottom family. Frank and Alice, both Aurors, and their infant son Neville. Frank and Alice were talented fighters who had thwarted Voldemort personally 3 times, making them high-priority targets. Alastor organized the defense personally, choosing the best fighters from the Order, setting up protective wards around the Longbottom home, preparing contingency plans for every possible attack vector. He spent a week ensuring every detail was perfect, every weakness covered. The Death Eaters came at midnight, a force of nearly 20 led by Bellatrix Lestrange herself, a witch whose cruelty was matched only by her skill. The battle was fierce and desperate, spells lighting up the night sky, the Longbottom home becoming a fortress under siege. But Alastor's preparations held. The wards channeled the attackers into kill zones where Order members waited. His enhanced eye spotted Death Eaters trying to infiltrate from unexpected angles. His strategic planning meant that every Order member knew their role, knew where to fall back if overwhelmed, knew how to support each other. The battle lasted 3 hours. When it ended, 5 Death Eaters were captured, including Bellatrix's husband Rodolphus. The others fled. Frank, Alice, and little Neville were safe, not a scratch on them. 2 Order members were injured, but would recover. It was a complete victory, a testament to preparation and teamwork and constant vigilance. Frank Longbottom shook Alastor's hand with tears in his eyes. "You saved our son," he said. "We'll never forget this." Alastor, uncomfortable with gratitude, just nodded. "Just doing my job. But watch yourselves. The Death Eaters don't give up easily. They'll try again." He was right, of course. They would try again, and eventually they would succeed in a different, more terrible way. But that night, at least, good had triumphed over evil. and a child slept safely because vigilance had held the line. As the war ground on, as more friends fell and more battles were fought, Alastor became the embodiment of everything the Order needed: experience, skill, unwavering dedication, and the absolute refusal to give up no matter how dark things became. Younger Order members looked to him for guidance, for training, for the certainty that someone knew what they were doing in the chaos of war. He trained them ruthlessly but fairly, teaching them to think defensively, to question everything, to trust their instincts. Some thought him paranoid, even within the Order, but those who survived did so largely because they followed his advice. The famous photograph, the one that would survive long after many of those in it were gone, was taken in 1980 at an Order meeting. 21 witches and wizards standing together, wands ready, faces grave but determined. In the back row stood Alastor, his magical eye bright and alert, his scarred face set in grim determination. Around him were the best and bravest of their generation, all ready to fight, all willing to die if necessary. Looking at that photograph in later years, Alastor would remember each face, each name, each story. He would remember who survived and who fell, who kept faith and who broke, who stood firm and who ran. He would remember that they had been young once, had believed they could win, had fought with everything they had, and in the end they had won, though the cost would prove almost unbearable. The night of October 31st, 1981, changed everything. Word spread through the magical community like wildfire. Lord Voldemort was gone, vanquished by a child, a 1-year-old boy named Harry Potter, who had somehow survived the killing curse. The Dark Lord's reign of terror had ended not with a climactic battle, but with the inexplicable protection of a mother's love and the mysterious power it had bestowed upon her son. Alastor Moody, now in his early 60s, received the news in the early hours of November 1st. He was in his office at the Ministry, reviewing reports of the previous night's attacks, for Death Eaters had struck even as their master fell, when Albus Dumbledore himself appeared in his doorway, looking older and more tired than Alastor had ever seen him. "It's over, Alastor," Dumbledore said quietly. "Tom Riddle is gone." Alastor's magical eye swiveled to fix on the headmaster, while his normal eye continued scanning the reports. "Gone how? Dead? Captured? Hiding?" "Something between all three, I suspect," Dumbledore replied, entering the office and settling into a chair without invitation. He attempted to kill young Harry Potter, and somehow the curse rebounded. His body was destroyed, though whether he is truly dead. The headmaster trailed off, his expression troubled. "I have my concerns. But for now, the immediate threat is ended. His Death Eaters are fleeing or surrendering. The war, as we knew it, is over." Alastor should have felt relief, perhaps even joy. They had won. The Order had survived, had fought for over a decade, and had seen their enemy defeated. But instead, he felt only a hollow wariness, a deep suspicion that victory had come too easily, too strangely. "You don't believe he's truly gone," Alastor said. "It wasn't a question." "I believe we have been granted a reprieve," Dumbledore answered carefully. "How long that reprieve will last, I cannot say. But for now, Harry Potter is safe, Voldemort is vanquished, and our world can begin to heal." The weeks and months that followed were chaotic. Death Eaters were rounded up, some captured in the act of fleeing, others tracked down by Aurors, who had been building cases for years. Alastor personally brought in a dozen of them, his enhanced eyes seeing through their disguises, his preparation thwarting their escape attempts. The trials were swift, the sentences harsh. Azkaban filled with dark wizards and witches who had terrorized Britain for over a decade. But some escaped justice. Lucius Malfoy, claiming he had been under the Imperious Curse, used his wealth and influence to avoid conviction. Others had been careful enough to leave no concrete evidence, or had friends in high places willing to overlook their affiliations. It frustrated Alastor to no end, knowing that Death Eaters walked free while better people rotted in prison or lay dead in their graves. The Order of the Phoenix was disbanded, its members returning to their regular lives. There was a final meeting at Grimmauld Place, bittersweet and strange, where they toasted fallen friends and celebrated survival. Looking around the table at those who remained, so many faces missing, so many chairs empty, Alastor felt the weight of all they had lost pressing down like a physical burden. To those who didn't make it, someone said, raising a glass. To those who stood firm, another added. To constant vigilance, said a young Auror who had trained under Alastor, and everyone drank to that, smiling at the phrase that had become Alastor's signature. But as the celebrations faded and normal life resumed, Alastor found himself adrift in ways he hadn't anticipated. For over a decade, his entire existence had been shaped by the war, fighting Death Eaters, protecting Order members, planning missions, staying one step ahead of darkness. Purpose had been clear, enemies obvious, success measurable in lives saved and battles won. Now, in peacetime, that clarity evaporated. The Auror office downsized, many positions eliminated as the ministry declared victory and moved toward normalcy. Alastor was offered early retirement with full honors, a pension, commendations, the gratitude of a world that could never fully know what he and others like him had sacrificed. He refused, of course. Retirement meant letting his guard down, meant accepting that the fight was over. And Alastor Moody, approaching his mid-60s, scarred and battered but unbroken, was not ready to believe the fight was truly finished. Voldemort's not dead, he told anyone who would listen. Defeated maybe, diminished, but not dead. He'll come back. Mark my words, he'll come back. Most people smiled indulgently at Mad-Eye's paranoia, as they now openly called it. The war was over, Voldemort was gone, peace had returned. Why couldn't the old Auror accept victory and rest? But there were a few who listened. Dumbledore, who shared Alastor's concerns, but kept them largely to himself. A handful of former Order members who remembered how darkness could hide in plain sight. And a young Auror named Kingsley Shacklebolt, who sought out Alastor's mentorship and found in the older wizard's vigilance not paranoia, but hard-won wisdom. Alastor remained in active service through the 1980s, though his role shifted. He trained younger Aurors, passing on decades of experience and technique. He investigated cases that others dismissed as minor, but that his instincts told him mattered. He maintained his network of informants, keeping his finger on the pulse of Britain's dark, wizarding underground, and he fortified his home. The house he had purchased years earlier, a modest dwelling in a location he never disclosed to anyone, became a fortress of magical defenses, wards layered upon wards, protective enchantments refined over months and years, traps for the unwary, alarms for the cautious. His paranoia, as others called it, expressed itself in a dwelling that was nearly impregnable. Visitors were rare and unwelcome. Those who did manage to reach his door were subjected to intense scrutiny, identity verified through multiple methods, intentions questioned, wands examined. Even Dumbledore had to answer a series of security questions before being admitted, and the headmaster had smiled tolerantly at Alastor's precautions. One can never be too careful, Dumbledore agreed, settling into a chair that Alastor had first checked for curses. Though I confess, Alastor, I worry about you. Vigilance is admirable, but there is a line between caution and isolation. Better isolated and alive than sociable and dead, Alastor replied, his magical eye swiveling to check the windows while his normal eye remained on his guest. You of all people know that darkness doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It creeps in slowly, quietly, disguised as something harmless. The moment you stop watching is the moment it strikes. And yet, you must also live, my friend. This existence, alone in a fortress, trusting no one, is this truly living? Alastor had no answer to that. Or rather, he had an answer, but knew Dumbledore wouldn't want to hear it. That after everything he'd seen, after all the friends he'd lost, after decades of fighting darkness in its most vile forms, trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. Better to be alone and alert than connected and vulnerable. His mother, Isla, passed away in 1985, dying peacefully in the Highland home where Alastor had been raised. He travelled north for the funeral, stood beside her grave in the small family plot where his father also rested, and felt the last true connection to his past slip away. The house, with all its protective enchantments and generations of Moody history, he left sealed and warded. He couldn't bear to sell it, but neither could he bear to visit it. Too many memories, too much loss, too many ghosts. The late 1980s and early 1990s were strange years for Alastor. The magical world around him grew complacent, comfortable in its peace, eager to forget the dark times and focus on prosperity and progress. The ministry, under various ministers, pursued policies that prioritized public relations over security, that valued appearance over substance. Aurors who had fought in the war were gradually replaced by younger recruits who had no experience with real darkness, who saw the job as prestigious rather than essential. Alastor watched this transformation with growing frustration. He tried to teach the new recruits what vigilance truly meant, but many found his methods extreme, his paranoia excessive. They humoured Mad-Eye Moody, the legendary Auror, who couldn't accept that the war was over, who saw threats where none existed, who lived like a hermit in his over-defended home. The world has moved on, Moody, one young Auror told him after Alastor had criticized his sloppy security procedures. We're not fighting Death Eaters anymore. We're maintaining peace, not preparing for war. Peace is maintained by preparing for war, Alastor shot back. The moment you believe the danger is past is the moment you become vulnerable to the next danger. Constant vigilance isn't just a saying, boy. It's the difference between living and dying. But his words fell on deaf ears more often than not. The new generation of Aurors hadn't seen what he'd seen, hadn't lost what he'd lost. They couldn't understand that vigilance wasn't paranoia. It was survival. In 1994, everything changed. The Triwizard tournament was announced, bringing together 3 magical schools in what was meant to be a celebration of international magical cooperation, Hogwarts would host Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, and students over 17 would compete for glory and a substantial prize. Alastor, now in his mid-70s, but still active in the Auror office, was asked by Dumbledore to take the position of Defense Against the Dark Arts professor for the tournament year. The headmaster's request was unusual. The position was famously cursed, no professor lasting more than a year. But Dumbledore's reasoning was sound. "I believe," Dumbledore said during their private meeting in the headmaster's office, "that we are approaching a time of renewed danger. I would feel more secure knowing that Hogwarts students are being taught by someone with real experience in defending against dark magic, and more secure still having you at the castle, where your unique skills and perspective might prove invaluable." "You think Voldemort's coming back?" Alastor said flatly. "I think," Dumbledore replied carefully, "that we would be wise to be prepared for such a possibility. Your constant vigilance, Alastor, has never been more needed than it is now." Alastor accepted the position. Teaching wasn't his natural inclination. He had always been a doer rather than an instructor. But the opportunity to prepare another generation of students to defend themselves, to pass on his hard-won knowledge, appealed to him. Perhaps some of these children would listen where the young Aurors had not. He spent the summer of 1994 preparing for the school year, developing lesson plans that emphasize practical defense over theoretical knowledge, gathering teaching materials and examples. He was determined to give these students real skills, the kind that would keep them alive if darkness returned. On the evening before he was due to depart for Hogwarts, Alastor sat in his fortified home, checking and rechecking his preparations. His magical eye scanned continuously, examining every corner, every shadow, every possible point of entry. Years of vigilance had kept him alive when so many others had fallen. He wouldn't let his guard down now. There was a knock at the door, unexpected, unwelcome. Alastor's wand was in his hand instantly, his magical eyes swiveling to examine the visitor through the wood. He saw a figure standing on his doorstep, features obscured by a hooded cloak, wand drawn but not raised threateningly. "Who's there?" Alastor called, his voice harsh with suspicion. "An old friend," came the reply. A voice he recognized, a voice he had worked alongside during the war. "I need to speak with you urgently, Alastor. It's about Dumbledore and the tournament. May I come in?" Every instinct Alastor had developed over 5 decades as an Auror screamed warning. Something was wrong. The timing too convenient, the visitor's manner too studied, the situation too perfectly designed to catch him at a vulnerable moment. But the voice was right. The face his magical eye showed him was right. The person's knowledge of his name and location suggested legitimacy. For once, just once, Alastor Moody ignored his instincts. Perhaps he was tired after months of preparation. Perhaps he was growing old and his edge was dulling. Perhaps he was simply lonely enough that the prospect of conversation with an old comrade outweighed his usual caution. Whatever the reason, he lowered his wand and began disabling the wards on his door. "Come in then," he said, "but keep your wand where I can see it." The door opened. The figure entered. And in that moment, Alastor Moody made the first and last mistake of his career. He trusted when he should have remained vigilant. The curse hit him before he could react, before his legendary reflexes could save him, before his magical eye could warn him of the deception. He felt his body seize up, felt himself falling, felt consciousness slipping away even as he tried desperately to fight, to cast a spell, to sound an alarm. His last thought before darkness claimed him was bitter and resigned. Constant vigilance. Should have followed my own advice. When he woke, hours or days later, he couldn't tell. He was in darkness. Complete, absolute darkness that his magical eye could barely penetrate. He tried to move and couldn't, tried to speak and found himself gagged, tried to cast a spell and realized his wand was gone. Slowly, horribly, understanding dawned. He was in a trunk, a magically expanded trunk, like the 7-compartment model he'd once used for storing evidence. But this trunk had been designed as a prison, each compartment a separate cell, layers of magic preventing escape. He could hear sounds from above, footsteps, voices, someone moving around in what must be his own home. Polyjuice potion. The attacker had used Polyjuice potion to impersonate someone Alastor knew, had gained entry through deception, and now was presumably using Polyjuice to impersonate Alastor himself. The irony was crushing. The one person in all of Britain most prepared for such an attack had fallen victim to the very paranoia he'd warned others about. His security measures had been bypassed, not through force, but through the one vulnerability he'd never quite managed to eliminate: the human need for connection, for trust, for believing that an old friend's visit might be genuine. Days passed in the darkness. The trunk was opened periodically, someone reaching in to take hairs from his head, presumably to maintain the Polyjuice disguise. Food was provided, enough to keep him alive, but not comfortable. Whoever had imprisoned him wanted him alive, wanted to maintain the impersonation long term, which meant they needed him for something specific. And given the timing, just before he was due to start teaching at Hogwarts, the implications were terrifying. Someone was going to Hogwarts in his place, someone with dark intentions, wearing his face, trusted because they appeared to be Mad-Eye Moody. Alastor tried everything to escape. He tested every inch of his prison, looking for weaknesses. He attempted wandless magic, though he'd never been particularly skilled at it. He tried to signal for help through every method he could devise, but the trunk was too well designed, the magic too strong, and he was too old and too weakened by captivity to overcome it through force alone. The months that followed were a nightmare of helplessness for a man who had built his entire life on control and preparation. He could hear muffled sounds from outside his prison, his captor moving around, using his home, living his life. He tried to track time by the regular Polyjuice harvesting, but lost count eventually. Days and nights blurred together in the darkness. Sometimes he slept, dreams filled with battles he'd fought and friends he'd lost. Sometimes he stayed awake for hours, his magical eye straining to see through the trunk's enchantments, his mind working through every possible scenario for who had captured him and why. Sometimes he simply existed, conserving energy, trying to stay sane in captivity. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort or even the fear for his own survival. The worst part was knowing that someone dangerous was at Hogwarts, surrounded by children, wearing his face and using his reputation to accomplish Merlin knew what dark purpose. Students who trusted Mad-Eye Moody were being deceived, possibly put in danger, and he was helpless to warn them or protect them. Constant vigilance, he thought, bitterly in the darkness. Lot of good it did me in the end. 10 months. For 10 months, Alastor Moody, legendary Auror, veteran of 2 wars against dark wizards, the most paranoid and prepared wizard in Britain, was imprisoned in his own trunk by an enemy whose identity he could only guess at. 10 months of darkness and helplessness, of rage and regret, of desperate hope that someone would realize the deception before it was too late. When rescue finally came, it was explosive and sudden. The trunk opened, light flooding in after months of darkness, and Alastor saw faces he recognized. Dumbledore, younger Aurors, concerned expressions all around. Hands reached in to pull him out, to free him from his prison, and he collapsed immediately, his body weakened by captivity, his mind reeling from sudden freedom. Alastor, Dumbledore's voice, filled with relief and sorrow. Thank Merlin. We feared we were too late. Who was it? Alastor croaked, his voice rough from disuse. Who took my place? Barty Crouch Jr., someone answered, an Auror he recognized. Death Eater. Everyone thought he was dead, but his father had broken him out of Azkaban years ago. He impersonated you all year, teaching at Hogwarts, manipulating the Triwizard tournament. The students are safe, Dumbledore assured him, though it was a near thing. Voldemort has returned, Alastor. Your warnings were correct. He is back, and the war we feared is beginning again. Alastor closed his one good eye, his magical one still swiveling weakly. He had been right all along. Constant vigilance had been necessary, not paranoid. Darkness had returned, just as he'd always known it would. But this time, he'd been caught unprepared. This time, his own tactics had been used against him. This time, Mad-Eye Moody had learned that even constant vigilance had its limits, that even the most prepared wizard could fall if the trap was clever enough, and the moment of weakness brief enough. The recovery from 10 months of imprisonment was slow and painful, though Alastor Moody would never admit how deeply the experience had affected him. St. Mungo's healers worked tirelessly to restore his physical health, treating malnutrition, muscle atrophy, and the various ailments that came from extended confinement in a magical trunk. His body, already scarred and battered from decades of fighting dark wizards, bore new damage from the captivity, weakness in places where there had once been strength. But the physical recovery was nothing compared to the psychological toll. For a man who had built his entire existence on control, preparation, and constant vigilance, being rendered completely helpless for nearly a year was a trauma that cut deeper than any curse. He had nightmares of darkness and confinement, woke gasping in hospital beds, his magical eye spinning wildly as he tried to orient himself to confirm he was truly free. Dumbledore visited regularly during those first weeks, sitting beside Alastor's bed and speaking in low, gentle tones about what had transpired during the 10 months of impersonation. Barty Crouch Jr. had been brilliant in his deception, studying Alastor's mannerisms, his speech patterns, his teaching methods. The students had suspected nothing. Even experienced Order members had been fooled. He manipulated the Triwizard tournament to ensure Harry Potter would touch the portkey that transported him to Voldemort. Dumbledore explained, his voice heavy with regret. Used your reputation and authority to protect the boy while simultaneously engineering his capture. It was elaborate, long-term planning of the highest order. Should have seen it coming, Alastor muttered, staring at the ceiling. Should have been more careful. All my precautions, all my wards, and I opened the door to him like a fool. You opened the door to what appeared to be a trusted friend, Dumbledore corrected gently. There is no shame in that, Alastor. Even constant vigilance cannot protect against every deception, especially when dark wizards are willing to go to such elaborate lengths. Constant vigilance should have, Alastor insisted bitterly. That's the whole point. Watch everything, trust nothing, assume the worst. I preached it for 50 years and then failed to follow my own advice at the critical moment. Then let this be a lesson in balance rather than failure, Dumbledore suggested. Vigilance is essential, yes, but so is the capacity for trust, for connection, for believing that not every visitor comes with dark intent. You are human, Alastor, not a machine of pure suspicion. That humanity is not weakness, it is what makes the fight worthwhile. Alastor didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. In his mind, his moment of trust had been catastrophic failure, and the guilt of what might have happened because of his impersonation weighed heavily on his conscience. By July of 1995, Alastor was physically recovered enough to leave St. Mungo's, though the healers warned him to take things slowly, to allow himself time to fully regain his strength. He ignored their advice, of course. Voldemort had returned, as Alastor had always known he would, and the wizarding world was once again sliding toward war. There was no time for slow recovery, no luxury of extended convalescence. The Ministry, under Cornelius Fudge's increasingly desperate leadership, refused to acknowledge Voldemort's return. The Daily Prophet published article after article dismissing Dumbledore and Harry Potter as alarmists or attention seekers. The official position was that everything was fine, that no dark wizard had returned, that the peace of the past 13 years remained unbroken. It was, Alastor thought, with grim familiarity, exactly like the early days of the First War. Denial, complacency, and a dangerous reluctance to face uncomfortable truths. History was repeating itself, and those who refused to learn from it would pay the price in blood. Dumbledore, knowing that official channels were closed to him, reformed the Order of the Phoenix. The old headquarters at Grimmauld Place was reopened, its protective enchantments renewed and strengthened. The call went out to surviving members from the First War and to new recruits willing to stand against darkness, regardless of what the Ministry said. When Alastor received his invitation to the first meeting of the Reformed Order, he apparated to Grimmauld Place without hesitation. Walking through that familiar door, seeing the grim decor and feeling the weight of history in every shadowed corner was like stepping back through time. He was older now, more scarred, recently broken in ways he was still learning to acknowledge, but he was still Mad-Eye Moody, and there was still work to be done. The kitchen where meetings were held contained a mixture of old and new faces. Some Alastor recognized immediately, Remus Lupin, looking older and more worn than his years should account for. Minerva McGonagall, stern and capable as ever. Kingsley Shacklebolt, who had learned from Alastor years ago and had become an exceptional Auror in his own right. Severus Snape, whose presence Alastor viewed with deep suspicion despite Dumbledore's assurances of his loyalty. There were new faces too, members of the Weasley family, brave and loyal. Nymphadora Tonks, a young Auror with a gift for metamorph magic and enough enthusiasm to power a small city. Sirius Black, recently cleared of the crimes he'd been wrongly imprisoned for, haunted but determined. And others, each bringing their own skills and dedication to the Reformed Order. Dumbledore stood at the head of the table, and the murmur of conversation died away as he began to speak. "My friends," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years and accumulated sorrow, "we are gathered once again because darkness has returned to our world. Tom Riddle, who calls himself Lord Voldemort, has been restored to bodily form and is rebuilding his forces. The Ministry refuses to acknowledge this truth, which means we must once again stand as the first and perhaps only line of defense for those who cannot defend themselves." Around the table, heads nodded. These were people who understood what was at stake, who had seen darkness before, or who trusted those who had. "We face a long and difficult struggle," Dumbledore continued. "Some of us remember the last war and know its cost. Others are joining this fight for the first time. But all of us share a common purpose: to stand against Voldemort, to protect the innocent, and to preserve the light even when darkness seems overwhelming." Alastor listened to the familiar words, felt the familiar resolve settling into his bones. This was what he had trained for his entire life, what he had survived for. The 10 months in the trunk hadn't broken him. They had simply been another trial to endure, another scar to add to the collection. He was Mad-Eye Moody, and he would fight until there was no fight left in him. The Reformed Order's first priority was protecting Harry Potter, the boy who had survived Voldemort's killing curse as an infant, who had witnessed the Dark Wizard's return, who was now targeted by Death Eaters and dismissed by the Ministry. He needed protection, training, and support. Dumbledore assigned various Order members to watch over Harry, to ensure he reached his aunt and uncle's house safely, to guard him through the vulnerable summer months. Alastor threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity. He helped strengthen the wards around Number 4, Privet Drive. He organized guard rotations, ensuring multiple Order members were always watching the house. He planned evacuation routes and contingency strategies for every possible attack scenario. His paranoia, which had seemed excessive during peacetime, now proved invaluable. When it came time to move Harry from the Dursleys to a safer location, Alastor developed an elaborate plan involving multiple decoys and protective formations. It was complex, perhaps overly so, but thoroughness had kept him alive through 2 wars, and he saw no reason to change his methods now. The years that followed, 1995, 1996, 1997, were a blur of Order meetings, guard duties, reconnaissance missions, and the slow, grinding work of resisting a Dark Wizard who was growing stronger while the Ministry remained blind. Alastor trained younger Order members in defensive techniques, shared his decades of hard-won knowledge, tried to prepare them for the horrors they might face. He was particularly focused on teaching Harry Potter whenever the opportunity arose. The boy needed to understand defensive magic, needed to learn to be constantly alert, needed the skills that would keep him alive in the war that was coming. Some thought Alastor too harsh in his teaching, too focused on worst-case scenarios. But Alastor knew that coddling the boy would do him no favors when facing Voldemort's followers. "Constant vigilance, Potter," he would bark during training sessions. "You think you know who's going to give you time to prepare? You think Death Eaters will fight fair? Every moment is potentially your last. Act accordingly." The boy was talented, Alastor had to admit. Natural instincts, powerful magic, and a courage that reminded Alastor of the best Gryffindors he'd known. If Harry could be properly trained, if he could survive long enough to grow into his potential, he might actually have a chance against the darkness hunting him. The Order lost members as the war intensified. Emmeline Vance, murdered by Death Eaters outside the Ministry. Others injured, some permanently. Each loss hit Alastor hard, though he'd long since learned to process grief quickly and keep moving. Mourning was a luxury warriors couldn't afford until after the battle was won. By 1997, the situation had deteriorated dramatically. The Ministry had finally acknowledged Voldemort's return after the Dark Wizard's appearance at the Department of Mysteries. But the damage from a year of denial was severe. Cornelius Fudge had been forced to resign, replaced by Rufus Scrimgeour, who at least took the threat seriously, even if his methods were sometimes misguided. Death Eaters were operating more openly now, attacking both magical and muggle targets. Disappearances were becoming common. The giant community had largely sided with Voldemort. Dementors had left Azkaban to join the Dark Forces. It felt like the First War all over again, except this time, Voldemort seemed even more powerful, even more ruthless, having learned from his previous defeat. In late July of 1997, Alastor was called to an emergency order meeting at Grimmauld Place. The purpose was to finalize plans for moving Harry Potter from his aunt and uncle's house to the Burrow, where the protective enchantments tied to his mother's blood sacrifice would no longer function. It was a dangerous operation. Death Eaters would certainly be watching for any movement, and the journey would expose Harry to attack Alastor, presented his plan to the assembled Order members. The protection breaks when Potter turns 17, at the stroke of midnight on his birthday. That's when you-know-who will expect us to move him. So we move him before then, while he's still protected, catch them by surprise. And how do we protect Harry during the move? Arthur Weasley asked. Decoys, Alastor said, his magical eye swiveling to look at each Order member in turn. We use Polyjuice Potion to create multiple Harrys. 6 of you will take the potion and transform into Potter's likeness. We split into 7 parties, each with 1 Harry and 1 protector, each taking a different route to a different safe house. The Death Eaters won't know which is the real Harry. We'll have to split their forces. You're asking 6 people to potentially die in my place, Harry protested, having been brought to the meeting specifically for this discussion. I'm asking 6 people to help keep you alive, Alastor corrected harshly. You're important, Potter, whether you like it or not. You're the one you-know-who fears, the one Dumbledore believed can defeat him. Keeping you alive is worth the risk. The plan was approved despite Harry's objections. 6 Order members volunteered to take Polyjuice Potion. Ron Weasley, Hermione Granger, Fred and George Weasley, Fleur Delacour, and Mundungus Fletcher. Alastor himself would pair with Mundungus, trusting his own skills to keep his charge safe, even through Fletcher's notorious unreliability. The night of the operation arrived, July 27th, 1997. Alastor apparated to Privet Drive with several other Order members, his magical eye already spinning, checking for threats, examining every shadow and corner. The street appeared quiet, normal Muggle suburbia, going about its evening routine. But he felt wrongness in the air, that familiar prickle that meant dark magic was near. Inside number 4, they found Harry packing, preparing for his departure from the home where he'd spent 16 summers. The boy looked older than his years, the weight of prophecy and responsibility visible in his expression. Alastor felt an unexpected surge of sympathy. He remembered being young and thrust into war, remembered the burden of knowing lives depended on your survival. "Right then," Alastor said gruffly, addressing the assembled group. "We've got 14 safe houses scattered across the country. Each pair will head to a different one. I'm taking Fletcher to the one in Tonks's parents' place in Essex. The rest of you know your assignments. We fly, stay low, stay alert. Expected journey time is approximately 2 hours, accounting for evasive maneuvers." The polyjuice transformations were strange to watch. 6 order members drinking the potion brewed with Harry's hair, their features melting and reforming into identical copies of the teenage boy. Soon, there were 7 Harrys standing in the Dursleys' living room, and even Alastor's magical eye had difficulty distinguishing the real one from the decoys. "You all look identical now," Alastor announced. "If anyone asks which is the real Harry, the answer is all of you and none of you. Stay in character, watch your protectors' backs, and with luck, we'll all make it through this night." They moved outside to where brooms and thestrals waited. Alastor checked his equipment one final time. Wand secure, magical eye functioning properly, every defensive charm and backup plan reviewed in his mind. 50 years of experience told him this mission would go wrong. They always did. The question was how badly and whether they could adapt quickly enough to survive. Mundungus Fletcher, now wearing Harry's face, mounted the broom beside him with visible reluctance. "Listen, Mad-Eye, if things go pear-shaped, if things go wrong, you follow my lead and do exactly as I say," Alastor interrupted. "No improvising, no panicking, no disappearing because things get difficult. You're Harry Potter tonight, Fletcher, and Harry Potter doesn't run. Understood?" Yeah, understood," Fletcher muttered. They took off into the darkening sky, 7 pairs spreading out toward their respective destinations. For the first few minutes, everything seemed to be going according to plan. They flew low over suburban houses, heading northeast toward Essex, Alastor's magical eye constantly scanning for threats. Then the sky exploded with green light and dark figures on brooms. Death Eaters, dozens of them, far more than Alastor had anticipated. They'd been waiting, had somehow known despite all precautions. The 7 groups scattered as curses began flying through the air, each pair trying to evade and survive. "Stay close," Alastor shouted at Fletcher, already casting shield charms, his wand moving in the practiced patterns of 50 years of combat. A killing curse missed his head by inches. Another shattered his shield, forcing him to cast a new one immediately. But there were too many attackers, and they seemed to know which was the real Harry. Or perhaps they didn't care, were trying to kill all 7 in hopes of getting the right one. Alastor flew with precision, born of decades of experience, dodging and weaving, protecting Fletcher while simultaneously trying to fight back. Then he saw him, Voldemort himself, flying without a broom, his terrible white face illuminated by the wand light of spells he was casting. The Dark Wizard was targeting one of the other pairs, green killing curses streaming from his wand with casual efficiency. Alastor's tactical mind processed the situation in an instant. Voldemort's presence meant this was the endgame, meant the Death Eaters were going all in on killing Harry Potter tonight. The mission was compromised beyond recovery. The only objective now was survival. "Fletcher," he roared. "Evasive pattern Delta. Now." But Mundungus Fletcher, seeing Voldemort and the overwhelming force of Death Eaters, did exactly what Alastor had feared he would do. He disapparated on the spot, abandoning both the mission and his supposed protector. For a split second, Alastor was alone in the sky, his partner gone, Death Eaters closing in from multiple angles. His magical eye spun wildly, tracking 6 incoming curses simultaneously, his normal eye fixed on Voldemort's distant figure. He thought, with strange clarity, that this was how it would end. Not in his fortress home, not surrounded by fellow Aurors, not in some legendary final duel, but here, in the sky over suburban England, abandoned by an unreliable partner, facing overwhelming odds while trying to protect a boy who represented hope for the future. Constant vigilance, his father's voice echoed in his memory. "Watch everything, trust nothing, be ready." He had been ready, ready for 50 years, ready for this exact moment, ready to stand against darkness one final time. Alastor raised his wand, prepared to fight to his last breath, prepared to take as many Death Eaters with him as he could. He would die as he had lived, vigilant, defiant, refusing to yield even when victory was impossible. The curses came from multiple angles, too many to block, too coordinated to evade. He managed to shield against 2, dodged a 3rd, but the 4th, a killing curse cast by some nameless Death Eater he would never identify, struck him square in the chest. There was a moment of impact, of green light filling his vision. Then surprisingly, there was no pain, just a sense of falling, of the broom dropping away beneath him, of the sky and ground trading places. His last thoughts were not of fear or regret, but of satisfaction. He had fought, he had stood firm, he had spent his entire life preparing for darkness. And when darkness came, he had met it with courage rather than cowering in safety. His father would have been proud. His mother would have mourned but understood. Dumbledore would remember him as a warrior who never wavered. Constant vigilance, he thought, as consciousness faded, to the very end. And then there was peace. The news of Alastor Moody's death spread through the Order of the Phoenix like a cold wind, leaving shock and grief in its wake. They had known casualties were possible, had understood the risks, but somehow many had believed that Mad-Eye, legendary, paranoid, seemingly indestructible Mad-Eye, would survive through sheer vigilance and experience. His body was never recovered. It fell from the sky that night and was seized by Death Eaters, either as a trophy or simply to prevent it from being laid to rest with honor. The Order held a memorial service without remains, gathering at Grimmauld Place to honor a man who had given everything in service of light. Harry Potter spoke at the service, his voice thick with guilt and grief. He died protecting me, protecting a decoy of me, actually, but he thought he was protecting the real me. He spent his whole life fighting dark wizards, survived 2 wars, and he died because someone he was supposed to be able to trust abandoned him. He died doing what he always did, Kingsley Shacklebolt corrected gently, standing against darkness, fighting until his last breath. Alastor Moody lived as a warrior and died as a warrior. There's honor in that, even in loss. In the months that followed, as the war intensified and Voldemort's forces gained ground, Alastor's absence was felt keenly. His strategic mind, his experience, his uncompromising vigilance, all were desperately needed and impossible to replace. younger Order members found themselves in dangerous situations and thought, what would Mad-Eye do? His teachings, his warnings, his constant emphasis on vigilance echoed through every mission. When the war finally ended, when Harry Potter fulfilled the prophecy and defeated Voldemort in the ruins of Hogwarts in May of 1998, many survivors thought of those who hadn't lived to see victory. Alastor Moody's name was high on that list, remembered as one of the greatest Aurors of his generation, a man who had dedicated his entire life to fighting darkness in all its forms. His magical eye, which had been stolen by the odious Dolores Umbridge and mounted on her office door like a trophy, was recovered after the war and buried with full honours at the place where his parents rested, in the Scottish Highlands. The ceremony was attended by dozens, former Order members, Aurors he had trained, students he had taught during his brief time at Hogwarts, and ordinary witches and wizards whose lives he had saved during his decades of service. Kingsley Shacklebolt, who had become Minister for Magic in the war's aftermath, delivered the eulogy. Alastor Moody was many things, Kingsley said, standing beside the grave. He was an aura of unparalleled skill. He was a member of the Order of the Phoenix who fought in 2 wars against dark wizards. He was a teacher who prepared students for the realities of defending against dark magic. He was paranoid, suspicious, difficult, and absolutely unwavering in his dedication to fighting darkness. Some called him Mad-Eye, and he wore that nickname without shame. His vigilance was legendary, his preparation exhaustive, his refusal to trust sometimes frustrating. But that vigilance saved countless lives. That preparation kept people safe when they didn't even know they were in danger. That mistrust uncovered plots and prevented attacks. He told us constantly to maintain constant vigilance. It was more than a catchphrase. It was a philosophy, a way of life, the distillation of 50 years of hard-won experience. Today, as we lay his eye to rest beside his parents, we honor that philosophy. We remember that vigilance isn't paranoia when the threats are real. We understand that preparation isn't excessive when lives hang in the balance. Alastor Moody lived and died standing against darkness. May we all have such courage when our own trials come. May we all remain vigilant as he taught us. May we all remember that the price of peace is eternal watchfulness, and that warriors like Alastor are why we sleep safely at night. The magical eye was buried in a casket of rowan wood, protected by wards, laid to rest in the Highland soil where Alastor had first learned the lessons that shaped his life. The mourners dispersed slowly, reluctant to leave, each carrying memories of the grizzled Auror who had touched their lives in various ways. In the years that followed, Alastor Moody became legend. Children learning about the wars against Voldemort would hear his name alongside others like Dumbledore and Harry Potter. Auror trainees would study his techniques and strategic thinking. Defense against the dark arts students would read accounts of his battles and learn from his teachings. His portrait, painted from memory and photographs, was hung in the Auror office at the ministry, where his magical eye seemed to watch over new generations of dark wizard hunters. Colleagues swore that sometimes the portrait would mutter constant vigilance when someone was being careless, though whether this was genuine magical echo or wishful thinking, no one could say. At Hogwarts, Professor McGonagall, who had fought alongside Alastor in the Order and deeply respected him despite finding his paranoia occasionally exhausting, would occasionally tell stories about him to students in her office. She would describe his dedication, his skill, his absolute refusal to compromise when it came to protecting innocence. He was difficult, she would admit, suspicious of everyone, trusting no one fully, always expecting the worst. But he was also brave, loyal in his way, and utterly dedicated to doing what was right, regardless of personal cost. The world is safer because of wizards like Alastor Moody, even if it's also a bit more comfortable not having them constantly warning us about dangers we'd prefer not to think about. Harry Potter, who became an Auror after the war and eventually head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, kept a photograph of the original Order of the Phoenix on his office wall. Sometimes, during difficult cases or when facing impossible decisions, he would look at that photograph, at Mad-Eye Moody standing in the back row with his magical eye gleaming and his scarred face set in determination, and he would remember the lessons. Constant vigilance. Watch everything. Trust carefully. Prepare for the worst. Stand firm against darkness. Fight until there's no fight left. These were Alastor's gifts to those who survived him. Not just techniques and tactics, but a philosophy of how to live in a world where darkness was always waiting for moments of inattention. The Highland house, where Alastor was born, remained sealed and warded, a monument to the Moody family's centuries of service. Local wizarding families would tell their children stories about the Moodys, how they had hunted dark wizards for generations, how the most famous of them all had been Alastor, how his magical eye now rested in the family plot, watching over the glen one final time. On quiet nights, when the wind moved through the heather and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, the protective wards around that old house would sometimes glow faintly, as if the accumulated magic of generations of Moodys still stood guard. Some said it was just residual enchantment slowly fading. Others believed it was something more, the echo of constant vigilance, watching still, protecting still, never truly at rest. Perhaps both were right. Alastor Moody had spent 77 years preparing for darkness, fighting it, standing against it in all its forms. He had sacrificed comfort, connection, peace, and ultimately his life in service of a cause greater than himself. He had been shaped by war, scarred by battle, hardened by loss, but never broken, never surrendered, never stopped watching for the next threat. His legacy lived on in everyone he had trained, everyone he had saved, everyone who remembered his teachings and applied them to their own lives. The watchword of constant vigilance echoed through the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, through the Auror Academy, through defense against the dark arts classrooms. It reminded people that safety was not passive, but active, that peace was maintained through preparation, that light endured because people were willing to stand guard against darkness. And so, Alastor Moody passed into legend and memory, his life a testament to the power of vigilance, the necessity of courage, and the eternal struggle between light and shadow. He had been born into a family of defenders and had died defending others. He had lived true to his principles until his final breath. He had been constant in his vigilance, unwavering in his purpose, and eternal in his impact. The last entry in his personal journal, found in his fortified home after his death, contained only a few words in his characteristic gruff handwriting. If you're reading this, I'm dead. Good. Means I died fighting instead of rotting in bed. Keep watch, stay alert. The darkness never truly sleeps, and neither should those who stand against it. Constant vigilance, always. It was a fitting epitaph for a warrior who never rested, a guardian who never wavered, a man who gave everything so others could sleep safely in their beds. And now, dear listener, our story comes to its end. Let the image of Alastor Moody, scarred, vigilant, eternally watchful, fade gently into the peaceful darkness of sleep. His vigil is ended, but his legacy remains, a reminder that there are those who stand guard so others may rest. Let yourself rest now, as Alastor finally rests among his ancestors in the highland soil. Let the weight of his story settle softly, a blanket of understanding and gratitude. The stars keep watch overhead as they always have, and somewhere in memory, Mad-Eye Moody stands guard still, his magical eye spinning, his wand ready, his voice echoing softly. Constant vigilance. Sleep now, dear listener. Sleep peacefully, knowing that in darkness there have always been lights. In danger, there have always been defenders. In despair, there's always been hope. Rest gently, safely, as warriors rest after battle. Sleep comes softly now, like mist settling over the highlands, like peace after storm, like the quiet that follows vigilance fulfilled. Rest, sleep, dream gently, and may you wake refreshed, carrying with you the memory of a man who never stopped fighting for what was right. Good night, dear listener. Constant vigilance and peaceful dreams.